Right now, if you're dealing with tennis elbow, you're on one of two different paths. Path one is the stuck path, where you're stuck, you're resting, you ice, you stretch, maybe you try some braces, injections, things calm down for a little bit, but then the pain just keeps on coming back. And eventually you start wondering, will this ever go away? Path two is the intentional path. This is where you know exactly what's going on, why it flares up, and what it truly needs to heal. You stop guessing, you stop chasing short-term fixes, and you follow a clear plan to finally get that elbow pain-free so you can get back to playing again. If you're on path one right now, this video is designed to move you towards path two and save you months or even years of frustration. And if you've already tried doing all the right things, but you hit a ceiling, this is going to show you exactly why and how to break through. And everything in this video comes from helping over 250 people overcome their elbow pain and get back to the sport that they love pain-free, not by guessing and not by chasing quick fixes. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll get clear on what exactly tennis elbow is, all the different structures involved. Then we'll cover why it happens in the first place. After that, we'll go into all the different methods, what works and what doesn't work. And last, we'll cover the million-dollar question on how do you actually fix the elbow pain and get back to playing pain-free or just living your everyday life pain-free. By the end of this video, you won't just have exercises, you'll have clarity and a plan so you're no longer guessing or stuck in the same cycle. So let's start by getting clear on what tennis elbow actually is. To fix tennis elbow, you first need to understand what's going on. And sure, you can argue that why do I need to know it? Why not just rely on my PT or doctor knowing what's going on? Why take the extra time to understand what exactly is going on? I've seen this hundreds of times where people are just confused about what's going on, how to fix it, and having that clarity is key in terms of the next steps to getting it fixed. And sure, you can rely on your doctor, physical therapist for help. And at the end of the day, if doctors, physical therapists, they can't help you, then it is your responsibility to learn about the injury, to know all the details, and to build that path forward to get it fixed. So that's why it's so important to know exactly what's going on with your elbow, your injury, so that you can take control of it and finally get it fixed. So today we'll explain exactly what tennis elbow is in a way that you can clearly understand so that it helps you in terms of your next steps to finally getting it fixed. So why do we even call it tennis elbow? For a very long time, it was a common injury in tennis and still is to this day. So about 40 to 50% of tennis players over their course of their career will develop tennis elbow, pain on the outside of that elbow. So that's why we call it. So it's just a common injury that we see in tennis, and that's why we call it tennis elbow, but it doesn't mean that's where the injury happened. There's other names that we use to describe this type of injury, but tennis elbow is just the easy way to use in the general population saying, oh, you have pain on the outside of the elbow, let's call that tennis elbow. So yes, it's a very common injury in tennis, and in general population, we don't see it that often, but it still occurs to a high degree. So to understand tennis elbow, we first need to understand the different components that make up the elbow. So we'll start with the bones, and there's 3 bones that we'll go over, and to help with this, we'll use Mr. Wilson right here. So let's bring him over. The arm bone, called the humerus, that comes from the shoulder and connects to the elbow. So that portion is called the humerus. And then we have 2 bones in the forearm. The outside, the tennis elbow side, is called the radius, and the inside is called the ulna. So it's made up of 2 different bones. You can think about like the chicken wing with 2 different pieces of bone there. Very similar to that in terms of the anatomy. So understanding the bones gives us information on how the joint moves, how the joint functions, but not only that, the bones serve as an attachment point for all the tendons and the muscles crossing the area. So that's why it's important to know all these different bony landmarks, and that's what we'll go into next. This is the right arm, and these are the bones that make up that arm, just in a simplified way. So this would be the humerus. On the inside, we have the ulna. So this is on the golfer's elbow side that we'll talk about. And then this is the radius on the outside here, on that tennis elbow side. Then we have the wrist bones and then the fingers from there. The thumb is on the outside. So again, this is the right arm. And the reason it's important to understand the different anatomy here is because where the pain occurs for tennis elbow occurs on the outside here and actually attaches to the humerus bone on the outside in an area that we call the lateral epicondyle. So what does that mean? Lateral means on the outside, versus medial would be on the inside. Epi means the highest point, and then condyle is a rounded edge of that bone. So on the outside of that tennis elbow side, on the humerus, we have a bony protrusion, which you can feel yourself. So you can point to that elbow and you can feel for it. So it's the spot that points out. The reason it points out is that's where the tendons actually attach. And where tendons attach, that stresses the bone, and over time it starts growing out. So that's why we have that bony bump on the outside. So again, that's called the lateral epicondyle. And that's where the tendons attach that are involved with tennis elbow. So we would have that tendon out here. And then how tendons and muscles are related together and how they're organized is we have, I'll represent in black here, a tendon. That tendon then attaches to a muscle. On the opposite side of that muscle, we have tendon again. And then that tendon would insert to the bone, which we can just represent with a little bit of blue here on either side. So that's how it's organized, and that's how it's organized in the arm here. So where that pain occurs is right here on the outside of that tennis elbow in the tendon, and then we have muscles travel down the forearm on the outside, and those turn into tendon again and then attach towards the wrist. So we have bone, tendon, muscle, tendon, and bone again. And that's how it's organized. And where tennis elbow traditionally occurs is on the outside here, close to that lateral epicondyle, where that tendon inserts into the bone. So I'll just cover a little bit about the different joints. So yes, the elbow is made up of those three bones, and together they make up different joints. So where the humerus meets the ulna, that's on the golfer's elbow, that's on the inside, and this is what's called a hinge joint. So you can imagine like a door hinge, the door only opens and closes one way. So what that means is that this allows the elbow to just flex and extend, and if we just had this joint, we wouldn't be able to do rotation. That's where the joint on the outside, the tennis elbow side, kicks in. This is also a hinge joint, but it's a modified hinge joint. The way it articulates, the way those bones meet together, is it's almost like a golf ball on a tee. And that tee is what rotates on that golf ball, and that's what allows that arm to rotate back and forth. So if we only had that joint on the inside of the elbow, we'd only be able to do this motion here, elbow flexion extension, or having that joint on the outside allows the arm to rotate. And that's why it's so important for all these different sports like tennis, pickleball, golf, because we need that rotation for twisting, gripping, which we'll go into later, but those are common motions that aggravate the tennis elbow. And that's why it's important to understand the function of those two different spots there. So again, the inside of that elbow allows us to flex and extend, and then the outside of that elbow allows us to rotate. So you may be wondering, what's the difference between tennis elbow and golfer's elbow? And it basically means the same thing, just on the opposite side. So how tennis elbow is on the outside of the elbow, golfer's elbow actually comes from the inside, but it's a very similar type of injury. So instead of the lateral epicondyle, those tendons, those muscles attach, is the medial epicondyle. So again, medial means on the inside. So same idea. There's a bone that sticks out there called the epicondyle, and it's on the medial side, so that's why we call it medial epicondyle. And those tendons insert into that bony part right there. Then they turn into muscle, traveling down the forearm and attaching to the wrist. So essentially, it's a very similar injury, just occurs on the opposite side of that elbow. So golfer's elbow is on the inside, tennis elbow is on the outside. So if tennis elbow is a tendon injury, what even is a tendon? So that's what we'll go into next. So if we have this tendon and we zoom in on what exactly is going on there, what the tendon is made up of is collagen. So collagen is a connective type of tissue. Specifically, it's collagen type 1, which is very similar to a rope. So it's a rope-like connective tissue that's supposed to be strong, tough. It also has some other qualities. So what is the function of that tendon and what purpose does it serve? The tendon transfers forces from the muscles to the bone so that we can actually create motion. So they help in multiple different ways. Again, transferring the forces is one way, so you can think about it as a rope, which transfers force from one end to the other. It also helps to absorb shock. So when we're doing something athletic, when we're, for example, hitting a forehand, every time we hit, that tendon absorbs that shock. So it's almost like the suspension in a car. When you hit a bump, those springs in the car, that suspension helps to smooth out the ride. And that's the same thing the tendon does. So it helps to protect the muscles and the bones from damage by absorbing that shock. And then the last property is it almost acts like a spring. So when we're doing anything athletic, that rope gets stretched and it almost like a slingshot, like a resistance band, and then it helps to release that energy. So it allows us to be much more athletic. And a great example of this is this African tribe called the Maasai. And they have this ritual where they jump up and down since a young age. So their tendons get used to and they get stressed and they adapt and they become so spring-like that it looks like they're jumping on a trampoline, but in actuality they're just jumping on the ground. So their vertical jump is very high and it looks effortless because that tendon is storing all that energy, and like a spring it's releasing it. So that's how they can get those high jumps, by training those tendons and having very strong, stiff tendons. And another important thing to mention with tendons is that they don't get the same blood flow as muscles do. So muscle injuries, they get a lot of blood flow, oxygen. We need that oxygen in that muscle to create motion. In tendons, we don't. It's just collagen. This becomes very important in terms of how they heal as well. And we'll go into this a little bit later as well. So not all tendon injuries are the same. And there's different areas where that tendon can get injured. So we have where that tendon inserts into the bone, and we have where that tendon connects with the muscle. And these injuries are a little bit different, so it's important to go over the differences here. So where that tendon inserts into the bone on that lateral epicondyle, which is often a tender spot, that's where most tennis elbow occurs. And the reason for that is this is much more common for injuries that happen over time with overuse. Injuries at the tendon, where the tendon meets the muscle, those are more common with a quick, sudden injury. So you hit one bad shot that overloads the elbow and that triggers that pain or discomfort in this area. But more often than not, it's an overuse injury, and where that injury occurs is actually where that tendon inserts into the bone. It's very much like that cement that attaches that tendon and gets it stuck to that bone. While on the muscle side, the muscle fibers and the tendon fibers interlock in this type of pattern, and that's how they lock together. So it's important to understand that difference too. One is more like a cement, the other one is interlocking, and that's how they lock together. So now that we understand the structures and how that tendon is organized, next we'll go into the different types of injuries. Just because we have pain doesn't mean there's damage, and just because there's damage doesn't mean we're going to have pain. So that's an important distinction that we'll make, and we'll go over the different types of injuries that happen to that tendon and the different severities. So there's 4 different types of tendon injuries. And the first one, most common one, is just degeneration. So you can think about it as we have that tendon, that rope, and it starts fraying. You can imagine if we start pulling, overusing it, overloading it, it starts to fray and those fibers start to weaken. That's what I mean by degeneration. And this is really the most common type of injury. Anywhere from 80 to 90% of cases would go under this of not necessarily a tear yet or any significant amount of damage. There could be micro tears, there could be disorganization in that collagen. So again, just the best analogy for this would be to understand that it's almost like a fraying rope. And that fraying is what contributes to the weakness, and that's what contributes to the pain as well too. And then with this type of injury, it usually takes anywhere from 8 to 16 weeks of rehab to get back to being pain-free. So the next stage up from degeneration would be a partial tear, which means that there's actually some fraying in that tendon, there's a tear, but it doesn't go more than 50% of the thickness of that tendon. So that's what I mean by a partial tear. So a partial tear, again, goes halfway through that thickness of the tendon. And with this one, the recovery is a little bit longer because that tendon needs some time to regrow, but it is possible to regrow. So type 3 injury would be a complete tear. And that means that 50% or more of that tendon is torn throughout its thickness, or in some cases, that complete tear means that that tendon is completely gone and detached. So that's a type 3 tear. This only represents anywhere from 1 to 3% of the cases in terms of tennis elbow injuries. In the case of a complete tear, rehab can't really do much because there is no tendon attached. There's no way to train it. But if there is a little bit of that tendon still attached, we can train it. It is an uphill battle because 50% of that tendon is torn. However, it is uncommon. Even if you have severe pain, it doesn't mean that you have a complete tear. So I know some of these injuries can sound a little bit scary, but in most cases, 70 to 90% of tennis elbow cases is just that degeneration, that fraying, that is reversible and fixable using exercise to rebuild that tendon and get it stronger. And type 4 would be called a avulsion fracture. So this is the most severe type of injury where actually the tendon is intact, but it rips off with a little bit of bone there. Again, this is very, very rare. It is one type of injury. It's the most severe type of tendon injury where they would have to reattach that bone back to where it was. In most cases, tennis elbow is diagnosed clinically just based on the symptoms that you're having, but there are some options that we can do in terms of imaging. So an x-ray won't give us too much information because it only tells us about the bones. And in most cases, tennis elbow does not have any bony involvement. It's just an injury to that tendon. The two other types of imaging would be ultrasound and MRI, and they would have more insight in terms of what's actually going on in the tendon. So they would tell you if you have degeneration, partial tear, complete tear, but it doesn't tell us where, and it doesn't change the rehab approach because if it is degeneration, then we'll just do rehab. If it is a partial tear, then we'll stick to rehab as well. The only times that imaging changes what we do in terms of the recovery process, where it's a complete tear where that tendon is completely gone and there's really not much we can do in terms of rehab, and that could be surgically reattached, or when there's a complete tear that's 50% or more, we could still potentially do rehab, but we would have to start very gentle and build our way up as the tendon gets stronger. So that's the only two ways where that imaging can dictate and change the approach that we have with the rehab. But again, in 95% of the cases, imaging doesn't help in terms of the next steps to getting it fixed, and that's why it's not necessary. So a common myth with tennis elbow is that it's caused by inflammation, but newer research is suggesting that it's not. It's not caused by inflammation, and that's not the root cause of tendon issues. And that could be a reason why a lot of you are stuck because we're trying to treat it like an inflammation problem, icing, resting, stretching, which we'll go into a little bit later. But what we used to think was going on with tendon issues or tennis elbow was something called tendinitis. Now tendon, that makes sense, but itis, that ending right there, means inflammation. So now, with research all the way up to 20 years old at this point, is suggesting that inflammation is not involved with tendon issues, especially if they've been going on for weeks and for months. So if it's not inflammation that's contributing to the pain, what is it? In most cases, what that is, it's actually degeneration. And we don't see inflammation, or we don't see a lot of inflammation with degeneration. So that's where the ending osis goes in. So tendinosis would mean degeneration of that tendon, fraying, without the presence of inflammation. So tendinosis and tendinopathy would be better descriptions of what's going on compared to tendinitis, because what we're finding is that inflammation is not the root cause of tennis elbow. So a good way of thinking about what is going on with inflammation is just a symptom and a response that the body has when we have dysfunction. It's not the root cause of it. So when there's irritation to that tendon, yes, we can have some inflammation, especially if it happens acutely, so in an abrupt way. We can have an inflammatory response where we have increased inflammation, but that's the body's response. That's not the root cause. There's an underlying injury, which in most cases is degeneration, but it could also be a tear. And that's what's contributing to the pain, not the inflammation. So inflammation is just a symptom, it's not the root cause of tennis elbow. So what does tennis elbow actually feel like, and what are the common symptoms? The muscles and the tendons that cross over from that tennis elbow side, they help with bending the arm, they help with pulling the wrist back, they help with twisting, they help with gripping. So those are the common motions that aggravate the pain. So just picking up a coffee mug in the morning, brushing your teeth, picking up your kids, playing tennis on a backhand, sometimes even forehand serve, playing golf, all this stresses the elbow, and those are common motions that aggravate the symptoms of your pain. So gripping, squeezing something, twisting, like opening up a jar, pulling your wrist back, even holding like the steering wheel of a car can hurt, pulling open a door, just that bending can aggravate that pain because all those tendons and muscles, they help and assist with that. And it can be very frustrating because tennis elbow often occurs on your dominant side that you use more often. So it just gets aggravated throughout the day. It reminds you that you're always injured. And there's different spectrums of pain. So we have different types of pain in tennis elbow. There's burning, sharp, dull, aching, there's a soreness, and then there's no pain. So there's usually on that spectrum, burning pain would be the worst, then sharp pain, then dull, aching, and then soreness, and then no pain. But we can really have any of those types of pain with tennis elbow because of that tendon injury. So it's burning and sharp when that injury is more acute and more severe, and it's usually a dull ache or a soreness once that injury starts getting better or in that chronic phase of that injury. And then the location of the pain is localized to that lateral epicondyle on the outside of that elbow, but it can also travel up above the elbow slightly, and it can be in that muscle belly on the top here. So those are the common pain spots with tennis elbow. And tendons, they don't always hurt in the moment. So some people report going and playing tennis and not having any pain there, but they'll have pain the next morning. So that's a very typical sign of tendon issues, is not always pain. There can be pain in the moment, but sometimes that pain occurs after. And the reason for that is those tendons, they have a delayed pain response. So muscles, they usually hurt when we use them. If there is a tear, if there's any dysfunction, we would feel that in the moment, and usually gets a little bit better after. With tendons, we can feel it in the moment, but also we can pay for it later. So in some cases, some people would have pain during an activity and then the next morning, or they have no pain during the activity and then severe pain the next morning. And that fact can make tennis elbow a very frustrating injury because in the moment you feel fine, but then you feel pain the next morning. So what is going on and why do we get pain the next morning is tendons, because they're made up of collagen, have a slower response. So it takes time for that body to catch up and to give you that pain response. And another thing that happens during sleep is now we're not moving that elbow. So we're not getting blood flow to it. It's getting colder and we wake up and the tendon feels stiff. It doesn't have the blood flow. And that's why it hurts more in the morning. And then as you move it, it starts to feel better and better and better throughout the day because now we're using it. Now we're getting the blood flow. We're warming up that tendon and it's feeling better. So you can think about it as a sunburn. Sometimes it doesn't hurt in the moment, but you pay for it the next day with a sunburn and your skin is burning. Or you can think about it as a cold car in Alaska or somewhere where you need that time for that car to warm up before you can start driving it. That's how you want to think about your elbow, and that's why it's so important to warm it up, especially in the morning, so that the day feels better. So now that we know what tennis elbow is, next we'll go into why it even happens. So simply put, tennis elbow happens because the stress that we put on that tendon is too much for that tendon to handle, and that's what contributes to the degeneration and pain in that elbow, leading to tennis elbow. So the best way or easiest way to describe this is on one side we have stress, and on the other side we have the capacity of that elbow. And when tennis elbow happens, we have too much stress, and when that stress is higher than how much that elbow can handle, this is what leads to that degeneration, potentially some fraying, some tears, and pain long term. And if this happens for a very long period of time, that's how it can lead to that degeneration and that fraying of that tendon. So you can think about it as maxing out your credit card. If we just spend on that credit card and we max it all the time, then it's not enough for us to handle and we won't be able to pay it off. And that's when we would have that injury in this case, or in this analogy, is when we can't pay off that credit card. The stress is too much for that elbow to handle and to recover from, leading to injuries in the long term. So in most cases, what happens is it's a chronic type of injury where overload over a long period of time, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's weeks, it's months of overplaying, overuse, too much loading on that tendon, resulting in pain long term. So you can think about it as the straw that broke the camel's back, rather than just being one intense moment where we had a tear, which would be more of an acute injury. In most cases, it's just chronic overstress, overuse of that tendon, leading to degeneration. So yes, it can happen where stress is tremendous. We have one bad shot, something that triggers that pain. So this would be more of that acute injury. That can happen, but in most cases, what happens is that chronic type of injury where chronic stress over a long period of time leads to that injury. And that's why we have tennis elbow. So the downside of having this high stress on that tendon is not only the pain, but because of that degeneration, that fraying, that weakening of that elbow, we actually decrease the capacity of how much that elbow can handle. So this leads to us having more pain when we're playing, not being able to handle daily things like brushing your teeth, picking up a coffee mug, and having pain in the morning. So that chronic stress, overusing that elbow, over the long term starts to decrease that capacity, leading to worsening symptoms. And it feels like your window of opportunity of how much that elbow can handle starts to shrink and shrink and shrink. So maybe you go from playing 3 times a week to 2 times a week to 1 time a week to playing just 1 time a month. Or you go from just having pain with playing to now having pain throughout your regular life, throughout just doing simple regular motions throughout the day that used to not bother it, but now it is, because that capacity, that resilience, and that strength of that elbow is shrinking. And that's what leads to the chronic symptoms. That's what leads to tennis elbow being so frustrating. It's not the inflammation, it's not the pain in the moment, it's the restriction and reduction of how much we can handle, how much that elbow can do. And again, just because we're having pain doesn't mean that we have damage. So how you can think about this is, as capacity reduces, it's almost like having a smoke detector that becomes more sensitive. So now the smoke detector goes off when it's not supposed to, that being our pain, that dysfunction of that tennis elbow. And inflammation doesn't mean that there's going to be pain or dysfunction long-term too. So the goal is not to necessarily reduce stress, but to rebuild that capacity so that the stress of everyday life, of playing, is low enough so that the elbow can recover from it and we can get back to our regular life. Essentially, we're opening up that window of opportunity that we can do more with less pain or no pain. So this is what I mean by stress on that elbow. So here we have the tendon, the muscle, and then the tendon again attaching to the hand, the wrist. And a good way to explain this is with a backhand in tennis. So if I hold my hand like this, what I mean by this is that ball would impact on that racket. And in most cases, what that actual loading looks like is eccentric loading. When the muscle is contracting and is being stretched, that's what causes that strain and tension on that tendon. So in this case, I'm holding that racket, I'm hitting the ball, but the ball is hitting back at the racket, pulling it down, and this pulls and stretches the wrist, pulling on the tendon here, and that pulls on the muscle and provides tension and stress on that tendon in the elbow. So when that ball hits the racket, that spikes the forces going through that tendon, and over time, hundreds and thousands of these shots accumulate and stress that tendon, causing overload injuries. So tennis elbow happens because of mechanical loading and mechanical stress on that tendon, leading to degeneration over time. And if that wasn't clear, we can even draw it out here. So here we have the arm bone, here we have the elbow and the forearm. In the black here would be the tendon, muscle, and then tendon again attaching to the wrist. In the green here, we have the racket, and then this would be that tennis ball. So when that tennis ball is traveling fast and hitting that racket, what happens is now the racket gets pulled back with force, This pulls on and stretches that tendon here, causing load and compression to that tendon there, leading to injuries on that tendon that attaches to that lateral epicondyle on that tennis elbow. So that's how mechanical stress leads to tennis elbow, but there are some other factors that multiply the stress on that elbow. For example, using a bad technique in tennis could increase how much strain we put on that elbow, or there could be compensations coming from the neck or shoulder that also contribute to that elbow pain. So the shoulder controls the rotation, and overall it's connected to that elbow through a kinetic chain. So if we have the arm connected to the table here, if I rotate the shoulder, you can see that the elbow moves as well. So you can think about the shoulder as being the horsepower, the engine of the upper body, where it connects the torso to the arm. And if something is off in this kinetic chain here, that bleeds through and causes more stress and strain on the elbow. For example, in a tennis serve, if somebody has instability or lack of motion in their shoulder, that could cause extra strain and overuse in the elbow because it's compensating. You can think about like a highway and traffic. If there's traffic up here, then that's going to affect the transfer of energy down the line. So it's going to clog that up. And essentially, if that traffic is happening at the shoulder, then we have more stress and strain on that elbow. So when we're actually using that elbow, specifically for athletic motions like golf, tennis, we use the forces from our legs all the way up from the ground, transfer to the core, torso, shoulder, and then arm. So that's how we create any motion. We push against the ground, and that's what I mean by the kinetic chain, the connection between the arm all the way down to our feet, and that force that we transfer through. Again, if it bleeds through the shoulder, it'll result in more compensations and pain at that elbow. So you can think of the shoulder as the foundation for the arm. And if there's something off here, if there's instability, weakness, lack of motion, that results in more strain and overuse in the elbow. So when you're treating tennis elbow, it's also important to take a look at the shoulder, the neck, basically the whole kinetic chain, to make sure that you're treating it accordingly. Because if you fix the elbow, but you don't address the shoulder, then potentially that pain can come back in the future because of those compensations. And this is something that we see often. So when we're assessing people with elbow pain, I'd say anywhere from 25 to 50% have some dysfunction in the shoulder that's contributing to their pain, especially when they're athletic, when they're playing tennis. Any overhead activities tends to stress that shoulder to an even greater extent. So with the shoulder, we have the shoulder blade, the scapula, and this needs to be stable so that the shoulder and elbow can function well. So any instability in this area, any weakness, any compensations can directly contribute to more elbow pain and elbow dysfunction down the line. So in most cases, when you do have tennis elbow, yes, there's an injury, there's something going on in the elbow, but there could be compensations coming from the shoulder. So I'm not saying it's all coming from the shoulder is the root cause of the pain. I'm just saying it could be a contributing factor resulting in making that tennis elbow worse, or potentially putting more strain on that tennis elbow, making it more likely for you to develop it. So how I want you to think about this kinetic chain is proximal stability provides distal mobility. So when we're using that arm, we want what's closest to the body to be nice and stable to provide the foundation so that we can use the elbow in its best way possible. So a good example of this in tennis would be, instead of using that elbow to hit the ball, using the shoulder, the upper body, the hips rotating through and using that power and saving the arm, just having that arm go through with momentum, saves the arm and puts less stress and strain there as opposed to arming the shot. So when we start developing tennis elbow, there's 3 changes that occur at that tendon and around it that contribute to the pain. So with the tendon itself, in that collagen, what we see is that collagen starts to get disorganized. What I mean by this is that healthy collagen would be interlocked like this, aligned in a straight pattern. When we start having some dysfunction, it starts fraying and it's not as straight. So that's what I mean by disorganized collagen. Another thing that happens is water goes into that tendon to start protecting it. So on imaging and on findings, we'll see that that tendon will start to thicken. So oftentimes they'll report that on findings that the tendon looks thickened, and that's what happens. So when we have some irritation, dysfunction in that tendon, disorganization, water will enter that tendon and it will be a little bit thicker. With chronic tennis elbow, we'll have increased vascularization as well too. So there'll be an increase of how much blood flow goes to the area to start healing the tendon as well. And there's also issues with remodeling. So at any point, there's breakdown and there's rebuilding. What I mean by issues with the remodeling is the breakdown is now higher than how fast it can rebuild, and that balance is off. Ideally, we want the rebuilding to happen faster and to catch up to how fast that tendon is being broken down. But in this case, it's flipped, where the breakdown is happening faster than how fast that tendon can start rebuilding. So that's what's going on in the tendon itself. Then we have changes that happen with the nerve. So that nerve that goes into that tendon, especially when it starts to become chronic, it starts to grow in, and it changes to the point where we start developing more chronic pain. And the longer that the tennis elbow goes for, another thing that happens is the longer this progresses and the more that that nerve grows into that tendon, the harder it becomes to treat. It's still treatable, it's still fixable, but that recovery process will take a little bit longer because of those changes happening to the nerve in that tendon. So it's more sensitized. Now normal activities start to hurt more. The pain becomes more constant, more frustrating. It's more easily triggered by regular everyday motions, and we get point tenderness. What I mean by this is when we poke at that elbow or around that elbow, it's more tender to touch. So that's what I mean by point tenderness. With those nerve changes, this becomes much more common because of those changes in the nerve. And then the last change that happens is actually how we start moving. So we start babying the arm, we don't use it as much, or we alter the way we move. And this increases the chances of other injuries. And a good analogy here is, imagine you're walking and you get a rock in your shoe. Instead of getting rid of the rock, you just keep on moving with that rock in your shoe and it's bothering you. So what do? You start moving differently. You start changing how you place your foot, and that changes how you use the ankle and how you distribute the forces along that whole kinetic chain. So that's why developing shoulder issues can lead to tennis elbow, or tennis elbow can lead to shoulder issues. It's also common for people to start developing tennis elbow, and that transfers to golfer's elbow because a lot of those structures work together. So if there's compensations happening at the tennis elbow, you start moving differently, you start overloading the other area, then you can start developing golfer's elbow. Another thing that happens is usually tennis elbow occurs on your dominant side. So now if your dominant side is hurting, you start lifting more, you start using the non-dominant side, and that's where we can get tennis elbow that happens on the right side to transfer to the left side, because now we're using the left side more. It's not used to the stress, that it's not used to being used as much as the right one. So now it's overwhelmed and it starts developing tennis elbow as well. So that's why tennis elbow happens, because of the mechanical strain and stress on that tendon. Next, we'll go into, can that tendon actually heal? So can tendons actually heal? And if they can, how do they heal? So that's what we'll go over next. So yes, the short answer is those tendons can heal. Those tendons have the ability and the capacity to start rebuilding, to start adapting, just like any other tissue. But for a very long time, because of the lack of blood flow and because of how slow those tendons heal, we used to think that once there's dysfunction, once there's a tear in that tendon, that it can't really heal. But now we're finding that with research coming out showing that yes, it can remodel, it can rebuild, it can get strong enough, as long as there's still some tendon attached. So if it's completely ruptured, there's really not much we can do. But if there is some of that tendon attached, like in a partial tear or with just some simple degeneration, it 100% has the capacity to start rebuilding. However, how it heals is very important, because the way we think that tendons heal is and how we treat it is very different than how they actually heal and what they need to recover. So that's what we'll go into next. So when we have that tendon, again, it's made out of tendon cells called tenocytes. So those are tendon cells. And let's say in the red we have marked an injury here in the middle. Let's say it's some fraying, some degeneration that's contributing to that pain. So how that tendon would heal is we need to first understand what that tendon's role is that tenocyte, and how we can stimulate it to start the recovery process. So tenocytes are actually mechanosensitive. So what does that mean? Our eyes can see, our ears can hear, our skin can feel. The role of those tendons and how they sense what's going around the world is they sense loading. And that's really the only input that they can pick up on, is loading and pain. So we use that to our advantage because it's that loading that stimulates that tendon to start the healing process through a process called mechanotransduction, which is a fancy term for saying that the load, the resistance, the strain that we put on that tendon, a healthy amount of it, starts a signal that then rebuilds the body. So what do I mean by load? By loading, I mean using weights, strengthening, loading that tendon in a safe manner, the right doses, the right weights for that particular phase of rehab. And this is what gives that mechanical tension, that strain on those tendons. So it gets pulled apart. And that's what signals to the brain, to the body, to start the recovery process. It converts that load that we sense throughout that tendon to a signal sending to the brain so we can start rebuilding that body, to start depositing new collagen, to start rebuilding that collagen, getting it stronger so that we can start that healing process. And this is why it's so important to understand this process, because now we can understand why resting doesn't really fix it. It just reduces the symptoms in the moment, but it doesn't give the load and it doesn't give the signal to start rebuilding. So does resting help to calm the symptoms? Yes, but it doesn't fix that tendon. If that tendon's only way of recovering is through loading, is through exercises, then resting, stretching, massaging, all these different approaches just help to manage the symptoms, but it doesn't rebuild the root cause of that tendon pain, which is that degeneration, which is that fraying or potentially a partial or complete tear in that tendon that we need to rebuild. So if that's how the tendon recovers, to rebuild the tendon, build back that capacity so that you can get back to playing or living pain-free. So here's an analogy to help with how we rebuild that tendon. So you can imagine we have that house, so that's your tendon, and it's on fire. So this is the initial stages where we do have a little bit of inflammation, but very soon we use resting, icing, stretching, all this to decrease the inflammation, and now that fire is gone. But what we get stuck is we keep on calling the fire department. So the fire department comes over and over and over again, but now there's no fire for them to take out. What's actually happening is degeneration. So you can think of this as the house being broken down, not strong enough, and just falling apart. So that's what I mean by degeneration, fraying, and that's what's going on with tendinosis or tendinopathy. So instead of calling the fire department, the resting, icing, stretching, what we need to do is get the construction crew back on site to rebuild that tendon. And what I mean by this is the right loading, the rehab plan, the exercises to start that recovery process through that mechanotransduction to start rebuilding that house. But a construction crew needs materials. And what is that tendon made out of? It's made out of collagen. So this is where the body uses that collagen, uses the construction crew, and both of these combined results in a house that's rebuilt. So we're rebuilding that capacity, allowing that tendon to be able to handle more stress, and that's how we fix this long term instead of just managing the symptoms in the short term. So next we'll cover how that tendon actually heals and what are the phases of healing. So let's say in this case we have that tendon, and in red we have represented a tear. So there's a tear in that tendon right there. So how does that tendon actually heal? So as we load it, as we strengthen it, actually the first thing that the body does is it deposits what's called type 3 collagen. So this is not the strong type of collagen. It's not aligned in a straight path. It's a weaker type of collagen that the body can deposit there very fast. So you can imagine like just patching it up, just putting a Band-Aid on it, just to keep it together to protect that area during the healing process. And then as we strengthen it, as we go through the process of healing and remodeling, that type 3 collagen slowly gets converted and transfers to type 1 collagen, which is the strong rope-like collagen that's aligned in a straight path just like this, and it's very strong, and this is what gives us long-term relief and makes sure that when we rebuild it, it doesn't happen again in the future, or reduces the chances of it happening in the future. So the loading is what stimulates that type 3 collagen to start transferring, start rebuilding into type 1 collagen, and it's what realigns those fibers so that they're aligned in one straight path. And when they're aligned in one straight path, they're much stronger versus being disorganized and like a jumbled mess. And this process takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and that's why it's so important to, yes, load it, yes, use exercise to rebuild it, but you want to think about it as getting 1% better every day. That tendon, that body doesn't heal overnight, so it's important to stay consistent, to put in that work, to give that body the time to start the remodeling process. And there's a lot of different benefits that exercise does for us. It brings blood flow to the area, it helps to decrease the pain, it helps to realign those fibers, it helps to get not just the unhealthy fibers, but it helps to get the other fibers stronger and healthier to help support the injured spot as well. It changes that type 3, that weaker type of collagen, to type 1 collagen, and more importantly, rebuilding it this way helps to prevent tennis elbow from happening again in the future because we fixed the root cause. We got that tendon strong enough. An important concept here to understand too is because this healing process takes a while, sometimes we can be pain-free before that tissue is even fully healed. So what is going on there? So let's say we have an injury that's not 100% yet healed. Let's say there's a little bit of a tear, micro damage there, fraying, and it's not 100% yet, but we're at a point where we're playing again, playing pain-free in our daily life, and it's not a problem anymore. So what's going on there? The exercise that we did and the strengthened the fibers around it, so now that area is protected. Another thing that exercise does is it helps to decrease the pain in the injured spot. So it protects the area, helps to decrease that pain, and it's true that you can have, let's say, a partial tear, and then 3 months later, still on the ultrasound, on the MRI, see the same findings, but you go from being in pain, 8 out of 10 pain, constant pain, to being pain-free, being able to golf, play tennis pain-free. And the changes that occurred there is through exercise, that tendon got stronger, more resilient. We rebuild that capacity for that elbow to be able to handle the stress of everyday life. So at the end of the day, that healing process takes a long time, but the benefits of exercise make it so that we can be pain-free while the tendon is still pain-free. And for most people, that's the most important part. They want to get back to using that elbow, back to their 100% function pain-free, and just having like a micro tear or some fraying in that tendon doesn't bother them as much. They just want to get back to their regular life. So even though you're back to regular function, it's important to still stick to the rehab because underneath, that tendon still needs an extended period of time to heal and regrow and get stronger. And the longer that tendon pain has been going on for, the longer we've had tennis elbow for, the more chronic it becomes, the harder it is to treat, and the longer this process takes. So that's why it's so important to start that recovery process early on to get back to being pain-free as soon as possible. So yes, that tendon can heal, but there are some factors that could slow down or speed up the recovery. These things could be age. So as we age, that healing process does slow down. It doesn't go down to zero, so it is possible to heal in your 60s, 70s, even 80s. And exercise has those other benefits too. So even if the healing process is slower, we can get back to being pain-free relatively fast. Other important factors would be sleep. Sleep is important for multiple different reasons, but during sleep is where that healing process happens. So we do the rehab during the day, that stimulates the recovery, but it's really at nighttime that collagen synthesis happens and that tendon starts to rebuild. So getting good quality sleep does make an impact on your recovery long term. Nutrition is very important too, so that tendon is made up of collagen. So if we're vegetarian, we're not eating enough protein, or we're not eating enough collagen, which with aging, we start to absorb collagen and protein to a lesser extent. It's even more important when you start aging to eat more protein and collagen, potentially supplementing with a protein powder or collagen powder to ensure that we're getting enough of those building blocks, like we explained before. With that house analogy, we want the construction crew to have enough materials so that they can rebuild the house. If we don't get in enough collagen, then we don't have the materials for that construction crew to use to rebuild that house. So those are some outside factors that can affect the healing, but the most important part of what we went over today is that that tendon can heal. It has the ability to remodel, to get stronger, and it happens through loading. And that's the secret, and that's the pathway that that tendon takes to rebuild, get strong enough so we can get back to being pain-free. So next we'll go over all the different treatments that are available for a tennis elbow, all the common ones, and we'll go over the ones that work and the ones that don't. So before I show you what works and what doesn't work for tennis elbow, we first need to understand, why is there so much confusion? You hear all these different things from a PT, you hear one thing, from your doctor you hear another thing, and even your friend chips in and adds his own recommendations on, oh, just rest it, ice it, stretch it, get a cortisone shot. All these different recommendations from all these different people just get you confused. So I'll go over why that happens and why there's such a big gap between the information of what actually works and what's commonly found out there and what's commonly recommended. So unfortunately, there's a big gap between when research is published and when something is shown to be ineffective or effective, and then when that is being practiced in actual practice. And the reason for that is, by the time the research is published, by the time a new truth is established, it takes time to update the textbooks in colleges, in grad school, for those new students to start adapting that new methodology. And then it takes time for them to graduate and start using that in practice. And the truth is that most clinicians don't stay up to date, especially on tennis elbow, because they're treating all these different types of injuries. They're not just focusing on one injury, so they don't have the time to stay up to date on the newest research on one specific injury. They're more of a generalist instead of a specialist, and because of that, that widens the gap. We've known that cortisone is probably not a good idea for a tennis elbow for a very long time, up to even 20 years at this point, but it's still being practiced and followed in everyday practice because of that research gap. So a lot of medical research takes years to become mainstream, and not because the clinicians don't want to help you, but because it takes a long time for it to be implemented into practice. So now I'll simplify each treatment method so you know what it is, what it does, and if it's worth your time in terms of using it for tennis elbow rehab. And as I'm explaining all these different approaches, what you'll see is a common theme of short-term relief versus long-term recovery. And a lot of these approaches are going to be focused on short-term relief and not long-term recovery, because that's focused on resistance, exercises, and that's what gives us that long-term relief. But there are some good tools that we can use that I'll go over to supplement the recovery process as well. So the first one we'll go over is resting. And resting is great. We can definitely use this in our recovery process, but we need to understand that resting won't stimulate that process of recovery. It won't give us the loading, the mechanotransductions to start healing that tendon. So yes, we can use resting in the moment to decrease the pain, to calm the symptoms, to let that elbow catch up. So essentially what we're doing with resting is we're decreasing that stress on that elbow, but we're not rebuilding that capacity. So you often hear people getting stuck in the pain rest cycle, where they get pain, they rest it, they ice it, they stretch it, the pain gets a little bit better, but as soon as they get back to playing or everyday life, that pain comes back. So yes, resting is a great tool that we can use to reduce the symptoms, to manage it in the moment, but it won't really rebuild that elbow. So next up we have icing, a very common treatment for a tennis elbow, but it may not be the best idea. And the reason for that is that tendon, it doesn't have a lot of blood flow. And what ice does is it constricts the blood vessels around that area, decreasing how much blood flow gets to the area. Another thing it does is it helps to reduce that inflammation, but we actually need a little bit of inflammation for the recovery process. So we don't have any direct research in terms of tendon rehab, and we can't definitively say that icing will slow down the healing process of that tendon, but we do have research that suggests, for example, doing an ice bath after a regular resistance exercise for building muscle. reduces the effects of that training session to almost zero. Because ice reduces the blood flow and the inflammation, so now the body doesn't have the stimulus to start the recovery process, to start rebuilding that muscle. And we can assume that the same thing happens with that tendon. So if we over ice, if we use too much ice, that can potentially slow down the healing process. But ice could be used in moments where we need that elbow to recover fast. So it's not a good treatment in terms of long-term recovery, but in the moment, let's say you have a very important tournament and you need that elbow to recover really fast for the next training session. So that's potentially an area where we can use ice to recover that elbow fast and get it ready for playing. But you need to understand that it's just a short-term treatment. It's not a long-term strategy. Next up, we have heat. Compared to ice, it is a better option in most cases because it does the opposite. So it increases how much blood flow goes to the area. So it widens those blood vessels, it opens them up, and it promotes the blood flow to go to the area. So in most cases, heat is a better option than icing. It doesn't give us as much relief in terms of pain, but it helps to decrease stiffness. It potentially can speed up the healing process by allowing more blood flow to the area. So again, we don't have definitive research showing that heat will help with the recovery process, but based on the fact that that tendon doesn't get a lot of blood flow anyways, heat would be a much better option in theory to help increase the blood flow to the area, start promoting that healing, help to reduce that stiffness. So it's a great tool to use to warm up the elbow before you do rehab or before you go out and play or before sleeping. Sometimes it can be even used during the morning time when you're having some stiffness in that tendon to help promote the blood flow to the area, to help warm it up, to make it feel better. Again, it's one of those approaches where it helps to maybe promote a little bit of the recovery, a little bit of the rehab, but it doesn't stimulate that mechanotransduction. It doesn't provide the loading for that tendon to start healing. It just helps with the recovery process in the moment, and it can give us some good benefits, make it feel really good in the moment as we're rehabbing it. So next we'll go into treatment methods that I like to call supports. So they help to support the structure of that elbow on the outside. And we'll start with the tennis elbow brace. So this is very commonly used for tennis elbow. So we'll go over how it works. So that tennis elbow brace is designed to be put right below the area of the injury. So it's also called a counter pressure brace. And the reason for that is it takes that pressure from that tendon where that tendon inserts onto the bone where we have that pain, and it transfers that forces a little bit lower down. So it clamps down on the lower section where we don't have pain, and it puts more strain there, offloading the painful spot. So we would want that tennis elbow brace below the area of the injury. We would want to have it nice and tight, not to the point where we're getting numbness and tingling in the hand, but it is a brace. So essentially what it does is it helps to offload that area. And not a long-term solution. It's what I call just a recovery tool. So if it responds well to you and you like it, that's completely fine to use it. Just make sure you understand that it's a tool, it's not a solution. So next up, we'll talk about sleeves. So these would be the sleeves that we just put on around the elbow. There's nothing negative that they can really do, and there's a lot of positives that we have it. So the positives outgrow the negatives in terms of keeping that elbow warm, keeping it feeling safe because of that compression. It makes us feel more safe, more confident in that elbow. So it's great to use as we're getting back to playing tennis, pickleball, golf, just for a little bit of support. It keeps that elbow nice and warm. It keeps that tendon warm and promotes more blood flow to the area. So it's a great thing to use during the recovery process. Again, will it fix the tendon? Will it regrow it? Will it get it strong enough? Not really, but it's a very helpful tool in the meantime to make it feel better. Another treatment that some people will use for tennis elbow is taping. And taping hasn't been really effective too much in terms of how much it can protect that tennis elbow and how much it can rebuild it. But the idea is we would use tape around it to help support the area. But the research suggests that it's just really pulling on the skin. It's not really doing anything to protect the tendon like the brace would. Really, most of the benefits I would assume that come from taping is just a placebo effect, that you feel more confidence, that tape is on the skin so it feels more protected and it makes you feel a little bit better during the moment. but it's not really a great option and treatment method to help manage that tennis elbow, and it doesn't really do anything to protect that tendon from further damage. So now we covered supports. Next we'll go into pain management. So massage would be the first thing we would discuss here. So massage helps to decrease the pain, the stiffness around the area in the moment. Potentially it can bring some blood flow to the area. But again, does that stimulate the mechanotransduction? Does that get that tendon stronger? Does that rebuild that tendon? Potentially, maybe to some extent, but it won't get us to that long-term effect that we want that tendon to regrow, be strong enough. So again, it's a great tool to use in the moment, to massage, to decrease that pain, to make it more manageable right there at that moment, but it won't rebuild it, it won't get it strong enough for our everyday life, and it won't rebuild that capacity of that elbow so it can handle more. A very common treatment for tennis elbow as well is dry needling or acupuncture. They're done with the same needles, just to a different extent and by a different practitioner. So when it's done by a physical therapist, we call it dry needling. When it's done by an acupuncturist, we call it acupuncture. And the difference there would be with acupuncture, it's more superficial versus with dry needling, it's more into the tendon or the muscle belly, sometimes even connected to electrodes to get a little bit of that muscle activity in there as well. So what we find in terms of dry needling is short-term relief, so relief in the moment after that dry needling, but unfortunately not too much in terms of long-term success and regrowing and getting that tendon stronger. So in general, how dry needling works and the biggest benefit that we get is that trigger point response. So in the muscle, we can have trigger points, and by sticking a needle in that trigger point, we can get a release in that muscle. So we can reset the nerves, reset the activity in that muscle. But if tennis elbow is a tendon injury and that tendon is made up of only collagen, there's no muscle in there, essentially what we're doing with dry needling into that tendon is we're creating micro damage. We're creating tiny holes in that tendon to stimulate a little bit of that inflammatory response, that healing. But if you already have fraying, if that tendon is already weak, it's not strong enough, then potentially dry needling that area is maybe not the best idea. It's not going to really cause any injuries or make that tendon tear worse. It's just going to aggravate that inflammatory response, which in theory should promote the healing. But if we can do that with loading, with strengthening, with that mechanotransduction that we went over before, then that sounds like a better approach to start healing that elbow long term than just dry needling, which seems to be much more effective for the muscles. Now, I'm not saying this is a terrible treatment, it's not going to work. A lot of people report having benefits with their pain with this treatment, but potentially looking at how that tendon regrows, it might not be the best option in terms of long-term recovery. Another option that you might look into for tennis elbow is cupping. So the idea with cupping is it's a suction cup here with negative pressure, bringing blood flow to the area. So in general, for tennis elbow, because we're not getting much blood flow to that area, that should be a good idea in terms of bringing that. And there's really not much downside to cupping. So when we're looking at different treatment options, we want to take a look at the upside, but also the downside of it. And with cupping, there's really not much downside other than just that cupping area, that mark that we have after doing the cupping. But there's potentially some upside of getting more blood flow to the area, of helping to decrease that stiffness and pain in the moment. So it may potentially be a good option to try out in the moment just to reduce a little bit of the pain, just to get that elbow going in the right direction if it is feeling a little bit stuck. But will it stimulate that pathway to regrow that tendon, get it strong enough? Again, mechanotransduction, loading, strengthening, that's the key for long-term success. Another treatment option for tennis elbow would be TENS. So TENS, we basically put electric pads on that elbow. The idea with TENS is those electric pads, they overwhelm the body's response, sending signals to the brain, shutting down the pain signal. But it only works while the machine is on, while those pads are on. So essentially how it works is like turning the volume down on your pain in the moment, but as soon as you take it off, that effect would last just for a couple hours and then it will go back to normal. Next, we'll go over meds, both ones that you would take, but also topicals that you would put on that tennis elbow. So it's common for people to take pain meds, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So what they do is they essentially decrease the inflammation, they make the pain go away in the moment, But now we know that inflammation is not the root cause of tennis elbow, so it just helps in the moment with the symptoms. If your pain is very high and out of control, potentially it would be a good option to use. But there is a potential downside to taking pain medication, especially for a long period of time, where it's shutting down the signal that the body usually has to start the healing process. And if we do that over a long period of time, potentially we're slowing down that healing process and we're not letting the body have the stimulus to start the recovery. So it's completely fine, and just taking pain pills one day or at one moment won't affect the recovery long term, but potentially overusing it, having multiple pills throughout the day for a long period of time could slow down that healing process. And in general, the idea with rehab and strengthening it would be to decrease that pain over time so you don't have to take pain meds. Another thing people commonly use to help with tennis elbow is topicals or creams on that tennis elbow. The most common one being Voltaren, which is an anti-inflammatory, so it helps to decrease that inflammation in the area. And then same concept as the medications before, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. We don't want to suppress that inflammation for a very long period of time, chronically, potentially slowing down that healing process. So the same concept applies in this case, is we don't want to suppress that inflammation for a long period of time, and that's what Voltaren would do. Another thing that people can use, it's a different type of topical that would be like Icy Hot or BioFreeze. This gives that elbow a sensation of being either hot or cold, which can help with modulating that pain. This wouldn't slow down the healing process, it would just make you feel better in the moment. So these are completely fine to use and it won't slow down the healing process. Again, these are called irritants, so it just irritates the skin on the outside and makes it either feel cold or hot, giving you that relief in the moment. Next, we'll talk about procedures and injections, and the first one up will be cortisone. And this is a big one, and it's a big red flag in the whole industry because for a very long time we've known that cortisone just helps with short-term relief in the moment, but it can make tennis elbow much worse long-term, and it can increase the chances of a full rupture. So like we talked about before, a complete tear of that tendon. And the reason that would happen is cortisone is a corticosteroid, and it's injected into that tendon, and it helps to decrease the inflammation, and it basically brings the inflammation down to zero. So research shows that it helps to suppress that pain for about 2 to 6 weeks, but because it decreases the inflammation so much, now we don't have the inflammation to start the recovery process, so the body can't naturally heal. Even if we're doing the right exercises, we lose that benefit from them because of the cortisone shot. And another thing that happens is now that pain is magically gone, so what do most people do? They overdo it. They overuse it, they get back to playing, and the activities that used to cause pain don't cause that pain anymore, so they think they're all healed. But underneath, they still have that tear, they still have that injury, they still have that degeneration, and now they're just making it worse, but they don't feel it because they're numb to the pain. Because of that, what the research shows is short-term relief the first 2 to 6 weeks works great in terms of decreasing that pain, but in terms of long-term results compared to placebo, they actually find that people have worse outcomes. And this becomes even worse when you get stuck in a cycle of taking multiple cortisone shots. So what often happens is somebody will get a cortisone shot, they'll get relief for a little bit, and then as soon as the pain comes back, they get another cortisone shot, and then that works for a little bit, and then they get another cortisone shot. And at this point, that tendon is so weak, it's degenerated to the point where we have an increased chance of a chronic injury or a more significant tear happening. So overall, this is one of the most frustrating things about the whole industry, because for a very long time, we've known that cortisone shots have a downside effect, specifically for the elbow, that it increases the chances of rupture, that it makes that tennis elbow worse long-term, but it's the only thing that the doctor can do in the moment to make your pain go away, to make you happy, to help you just manage that pain while they see you in the clinic for 5 to 10 minutes. Now, if you are in significant pain and you just can't tolerate that pain, potentially you can get a cortisone shot, but just know the downside effects of it and the potential risk associated with cortisone. And the frustrating part is a lot of doctors won't even explain this to you. Some will, but others won't. You just get a cortisone shot blindly without knowing the downside effects or the potential risks of it. All right, next we'll cover PRP, which seems to be a common treatment for tennis elbow. So first we'll go over what it is. So PRP is platelet-rich plasma treatment. So the idea is they take blood out and then they spin it so it separates the red blood cells from the white blood cells, and in the white blood cells is where we have the healing properties of the blood. So they take that white concentrated part of the blood and they inject it back into that tendon with the hopes of stimulating that recovery process, of getting that tendon stronger. Now, in terms of the research of the effectiveness of PRP, it's very mixed. Some studies show a slight benefit, others show no difference compared to placebo. And at this point, it's indefinite in terms of if it works or not. But in most cases, and what I've seen clinically, people reaching out to me, potentially I may be biased because I do speak with people that are still stuck in pain, that they report that PRP shot not necessarily fixing them long term, maybe managing, maybe decreasing those symptoms a little bit. So there still needs to be more research done so we can definitively say if PRP helps or not. But so far, what I've seen clinically, just through the cases that I've seen and the people that come to me and report their effects with PRP, so far I haven't seen a strong effect with PRP. Maybe some reduction in pain, but that pain tends to come back long term. Next treatment, we have shockwave. So the idea with shockwave is there's two crystals in that machine and they hit each other and that sends the shockwave throughout the body. And that shockwave, the idea behind that is it's supposed to break up scar tissue and it's supposed to start the healing process of that tendon. And so far in terms of the research with shockwave, what most research is showing is short-term relief in the moment, but not necessarily a long-term relief in the long term. So what I would recommend is for chronic cases that seem stubborn, it is a great option to just see if it works, to see if it helps to improve those symptoms in the short term, to maybe help break up some scar tissue, get the healing process started. But again, the secret to long-term success and making sure it doesn't come back in the long term is strengthening, is loading. All right, next up, we'll talk about ultrasound. So very similar to shockwave. So shockwave is those two crystals hitting each other, sending a shockwave through the body that would promote the healing response. With ultrasound, it's actually those two crystals rubbing against each other. And they create a sound that we can't hear. That's why it's called ultrasound. And that ultrasound is not like the diagnostic one, like the one where you would see if you're pregnant or not, or see the baby, but it's the one designed to be a treatment. How that differs is this ultrasound is designed to warm up the tissue. So essentially that ultrasound works like a heat pack, stimulating the blood flow to the area, heating that tissue up, promoting that healing, which yes can help in the short term, but in terms of the research, in terms of the findings, ultrasound hasn't been shown to be very effective in terms of treating tennis elbow long term. Can it be used in the moment? Yes, and the downsides are very low, but in terms of a long-term approach, it's probably not the best option. And then last one to cover here, which has been really popular lately, is peptides. And the important thing to mention with peptides is that the research is still very new. Most of the research that we have is on animals and not humans, so we don't know the effects of it on humans, but it is very promising for animals. There could be some potential long-term effects, some downside, potentially an increase in cancer rates and the risk of cancer. So there are some downsides to peptides that we still don't know about. But I just want to clarify that we don't have the research yet to definitively say what are the upsides and downsides of peptides. Some people do report having some benefits with peptides. I may be biased, but usually when people reach out to me, they've tried peptides in the past and they didn't really see any good effects with it. Another important thing to mention here is there's no strict quality control with peptides. So when you do order them, it's not FDA approved, there's no regulations, and you don't know exactly what you're getting and what you're injecting into your body. And when you're injecting anything into your body, it should be a bigger concern for you in terms of the quality, the ingredients that you are injecting into your body, because again, we don't know the long-term effects of it. So could it potentially work? Yes, in some cases it can be beneficial and people have reported feeling better, but is it necessary for recovery? No, not really. And the secret for long-term recovery, again, is loading. And you've seen that pattern over and over and over again All these treatment methods that we mentioned, just short-term relief, but not long-term recovery. Now, some people swear by these treatments that we went over. They said, hey, I tried this, it worked for me, now that pain is completely gone. In those cases, potentially that pain would have went away on its own. And now that they did that treatment, they associate that relief to that treatment, not just by that injury going away on its own. So this is where a little bit of placebo effect can be in play, where you try a treatment and our expectation of that treatment working actually gives us positive results. So the placebo effect is very real. And what the placebo effect is if we believe a treatment method will work, then there is a higher likelihood and a higher benefit that we do get from that placebo. How they would control for this in studies in terms of that placebo effect is one group would get the treatment and the other group, they think they got the treatment, but they actually didn't. So for example, for cortisone shots, one group would actually get the cortisone shot, and then the other group would just get water injections. So they both got an injection. Both of them thought they got the cortisone shots, so both of them have the placebo effect, and then they compare the results of the two studies to see if it's more effective than placebo. And that's how we know a treatment is actually effective. And unfortunately, a lot of the treatments that we have for tennis elbow, compared to placebo, they don't show to be effective. And a recurring theme in a lot of this research is if you combine a treatment with exercise, it always outperforms just the treatment alone. So now you learned how tendons actually heal and how these outdated methods don't stimulate that tendon to get stronger for long-term relief, and how exercises and loading and progressive loading is the secret to fixing tennis elbow for the long run. But probably what you could mention here is saying, hey, I've tried exercises in the past and it didn't work. I went to PT, I did all the exercises and it didn't fix my elbow. The key there is there's a lot of different parts in the elbow. There's 7 different muscles, 7 different tendons. Any one of those could be affecting your pain. And if you don't isolate it to exact structures, if you don't build that plan with the right dose, with the right exercises, with the right frequency, the volume, then you don't get it fixed. And that's what we'll go over next, is how to actually fix tennis elbow. So before we actually go about fixing the elbow, we first need to understand what is going on and what areas are actually injured. And where most people go wrong, they just go to their PT. The PT says, hey, you have tennis elbow, and they just recommend generic exercises that they give to everybody else. After fixing over 250 elbows, what we found is that not all tennis elbow is the same. And we found 5 major drivers of tennis elbow on the outside here in terms of that tendon and different muscles that contribute to the pain. And that pain could be coming even from a nerve traveling down. So it's important to isolate exactly which one is contributing to your pain. Otherwise, it's like taking your car to a mechanic, and if the mechanic doesn't take a look underneath the hood and find exactly what area is broken, then he won't get your car fixed. Or it's like trying to get back home without a GPS. So you may be doing random exercises to target that area, but it may not be addressing the actual root cause. What do I mean by the root cause? The root cause is the specific areas, the specific tendons that are contributing to your actual pain. And everybody's tennis elbow is a little bit different. It happens with different motions, and we can use that to our advantage to find exactly where the pain is coming from. So you can think of this as a movement screen to find exactly the hotspots of your pain, so we can isolate it and treat that. But this is not the full assessment that we do with our clients. So it's designed to be a movement screen focusing on the most important parts to help you and guide you. But in terms of a full assessment, we want to take a look at the spine, the neck, the shoulder, make sure that there's nothing else contributing to the pain, and then more importantly, isolating the exact area of pain in the elbow. But this is a helpful screening tool to help isolate the pain. We developed this initially using the tennis racket, and again, the idea is we isolate, we test, and based on the pain response, that's how we can pinpoint exactly where that pain is coming from. What we noticed is that most approaches and most plans were general and generic, but it wasn't designed for where that pain was specifically coming for that person. And we found that to be a huge unlock in terms of finally getting the results that people were looking for. So x-rays, MRIs, ultrasound, they can all be helpful in terms of letting us know maybe what's going on, but it doesn't tell us where what exact structure and how to fix it. So that's why we developed this assessment to help with that. And a little disclaimer here, because of how this assessment works, we're going to aggravate the pain a little bit to find the hot spots. If your pain is elevated and your elbow is sensitive, just go slow, go light, or maybe even avoid this assessment. So the idea behind this assessment is we're going to use the function of all those different areas, isolate them, test them individually, and then based on your pain response, we're going to rank them and build that plan around that to finally get it fixed. So for this assessment, we originally started this with tennis players using a tennis racket, but you can really use almost anything. So a broomstick could work, a golf club, anything that has a handle on it that you can grip, and then anything that you can push with the other hand as resistance. So as we go through these tests, we'll be isolating all the different areas, pushing against it, resisting, testing all those different areas, and you want to write down the pain response that you had from 0 to 10. So we'll start with the first test, which isolates the extensor carpi radialis longus. That's a very long name, but this muscle and tendon inserts above the elbow, and this is one of the only ones that crosses above the elbow, and then it inserts to the base of the second finger. And understanding where tendons insert, where the muscles go to, helps us understand the function. So because it crosses above the elbow, it helps to unlock that elbow. It helps with elbow flexion, especially with the arm facing up, like in a hammer curl. Then where that tendon goes to the opposite side is it inserts the base of the second finger at the wrist. So instead of the traditional tennis elbow exercise like this, what this does is called radial deviation. So this motion is called radial deviation because this is the radius, the radial bone, and this is that wrist deviating towards that radial side. So if that's the function, then the assessment, this test that we developed for it, is using the arm straight like this, holding that racket nice and strong, and then pushing away from you. So both hands are fighting against each other. You push nice and strong here, and then you write down how much pain you had with this test. Because this tendon, this muscle crosses the elbow, what we can do to further confirm that it's this one that the pain is coming from, we can do that assessment with the elbow bent. So now we're putting this area on slack, and if we repeat it and the pain reduced, then it further confirms that the pain is coming from the extensor carpi radialis longus. So this muscle, this tendon that inserts above the elbow, usually we'd have pain not right at the bony part, but a little bit above it. And usually the motions that aggravate it in tennis would maybe be a backhand slice because we're extending that elbow, we're extending the wrist, so it's being stretched on both sides and strained. It could be on a forehand when we're adding topspin, that upward motion here. That's what that muscle and tendon helps with. Other things would be like a hammer curl at the gym, or even picking up your coffee cup with the arm straight like this. So it's stressing that area right there. So it's a very common one, and we do see it often involved with people for a tennis elbow. Now, understanding its function will help us in terms of understanding what exercises to do to strengthen and load that area specifically. So my favorite exercise to load this area, and again, this is just one example, there's different ways to load it and strengthen all of these different areas. I'm just sharing with you my favorite exercise for this that I found is to grab a dumbbell at the bottom here so the weight hangs from the top. This way we have leverage to work against, and we're going to work on both functions. So it's a biarticulate muscle, which means that it crosses the elbow and the wrist, and it has different functions in both areas. And the best way to strengthen it is to work on both at the same time. So basically we'll be doing a hammer curl with radial deviation, bringing that dumbbell to the shoulder there. So we're doing radial deviation, and we're working on that elbow flexion in that hammer curl position as well. So all that combined looks like this. Really helps to load and strengthen that area right there. So this is the hammer curl with radial deviation. It combines both of those movements, and it's my favorite exercise to address the extensor carpi radialis longus. And whenever you start with exercises, just start with very light weights. It doesn't take much to start strengthening that elbow, and we'll go into this a little bit later, but always be cautious and careful and start with lighter weights. The next test we'll go into, test for the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So it's a very similar muscle, but it attaches in different spots. So where it attaches is on the lateral epicondyle, so the outside of that elbow, that bony part, so it doesn't cross as far up on the elbow like the other one. And instead of going to the base of the second finger, it actually goes to the base of the third finger, which is right in the middle of the wrist, which means it's more responsible for wrist extension. And the way we would test for it is holding that racket out like this. We go into the motorcycle position, so bringing that wrist back. And then with the opposite hand, I grab that racket and I twist away from me. So this wrist is pulling back, this wrist is twisting forward, and then we rank that pain. If we have pain with this one, it suggests that we have pain in the extensor carpi radialis brevis. This is the one that people most commonly think of being associated with tennis elbow, which it is true, it is very common, but in more cases than not, we've actually seen that the extensor carpi radialis longus, the one we just went over, is more affected in most cases as compared to this one here. So if the primary action of this muscle is wrist extension, then that's how we would train it as well. So the best way to target this muscle, this tendon, is by just wrist extension. And I like to do it with the foam roller here, right above the elbow, so we get an even deeper stretch on those tendons, those muscles there. And how we would do that is with the arm straight, just relaxing it down and lifting all the way up. Just like that. So this would be my favorite exercise if we do have pain in the extensor carpi radialis brevis that attaches on the outside here and goes to the base of that middle finger there. So again, write down how much pain you had on this one, and let's move on to the next test. So the next test is for the extensor carpi ulnaris, and this muscle goes from the outside of that tennis elbow, that lateral epicondyle, and it inserts on the ulnar side of that wrist. So the function of this one would be ulnar deviation. So again, this is the ulna bone. So this is the ulnar side. And when we move the wrist towards it, that's why we call it ulnar deviation, as opposed to this one, which was radial deviation. So it does the opposite of that. And the way we would test for it, straight arm, holding that racket nice and strong, and then pulling that racket towards us. You can either grab it here or grab at the end. And this is how we test for that extensor carpi ulnaris. So write down your pain level, and we'll go over the best exercise to start. So here's my favorite exercise for this muscle, for this tendon, if we do have pain with it. And again, the motion is ulnar deviation. And the best way to target this is to grab the dumbbell at the top here. So we have the weight hanging off the edge or behind us, having that arm next to our side. And then from here, we go into that ulnar deviation. So straight back, bending that wrist towards the pinky side, controlling all the way up, squeezing and going down. It's a very fine control motion. So that's my favorite exercise for that one right there. Next one up is the supinator muscle. So the supinator muscle comes from the outside here and it goes over the top. So it doesn't cross all the way to the wrist. Its actual function is supination. So this motion right here, when we open up the arm, that's what we mean by supination. You can think of it as holding a bowl of soup. That's an easy way to memorize this motion here. So you're turning your hand like you're holding a bowl of soup. So that muscle comes from the outside here, attaches to the top, and when it activates, it pulls that arm out this way. Motions that it's involved in and it helps with is anytime we're twisting. So like opening up a jar, shaking somebody's hand, sometimes even on a backhand here when the ball hits this way, we have twisting that occurs in the elbow. So it's a very important one and it's often involved. So how we test for the supinator is in an elbow 90-degree position like this, isolating that supinator, and we pull from out to across. So we would pull from this direction to this direction, resisting with the arm here. And if we have pain with this one, then it suggests that we have pain with supination. Again, we rank this from 0 to 10, so we can rank it later in terms of importance of all the different areas where we do have pain. And next, I'll show you my favorite exercise to start addressing this area. So here's my favorite way to target that supinator muscle if it is involved. So I like to do it with the foam roller so the arm is completely straight. This really isolates and it strains that supinator a little bit more. Keep in mind that whenever you're using the foam roller, it is more intense. So start with lighter weights and work your way up. So from here, we would turn that dumbbell in. Another important thing to note is we want to hold that weight at the bottom. If we hold it in the middle, then the weight on the top and the bottom is the same and there's no leverage, there's no resistance. That's why we want to grab at the bottom so the weight is on the top and we have that leverage and resistance to work against. There's two grips you can do. You can hold it like this, sideways, or you can hold it from the bottom. It depends what type of dumbbell you have and it depends on what's more comfortable for you. So from here, you would work on that supinator by twisting the forearm open and closing it just like that. So that's my favorite exercise for the supinator. Next, we'll go into the finger extensors. The next test here is for the extensor digitorum, which basically means the muscles that extend the fingers. So these attach on that lateral epicondyle, come from that same area, and they cross all the way to the wrist and they go to the fingers 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's how we would test them. We would do it with the arm straight, fingers extended, hand open like this, and I'm pushing against each finger, trying to break that position forward, and just noting which ones I have pain with and how much. So usually we would have the most pain with either the middle finger or the ring finger, but it's a little bit different for everyone. And here's a view from the side. So again, I'm resisting and I'm trying to break through, testing each finger individually. Take the pain that you had from this one, the most painful finger, and use that as a score for this test. Next, I'll go into my favorite way to start strengthening this tendon, to start loading it. So the best way to isolate and to work on these finger extensors is by using a band like this. So you just put your fingers through here, and this provides the resistance so that we can work on those finger extensors. So again, the role is to open the hand, and it helps with grip as well too. I like to do it with the foam roller so the arm is straight and working on slowly opening and closing, strengthening those muscles and tendons on that extensor digitorum. And the last test is to help isolate the radial nerve. So the radial nerve goes through that supinator muscle and it's a common area for it to get impinged and to cause shooting pain going down the arm. This would be called radial tunnel syndrome. So we'll go over how to test for it and to see if you have pain in that nerve. So that radial nerve travels all the way from the neck, goes behind the shoulder, and comes out the side of that elbow, back to the thumb, pointer finger, and middle finger. So how we would test for it is we would do thumb across like this. We would create a fist. Then we have that hand next to our side like this. We curl the wrist all the way. After this, we turn the shoulder in so that the fingers are pointing out. So now we're stretching that nerve here. From here, we do opposite hand on top of the shoulder, pushing it down. And we go out to the side until the arm is parallel with the shoulder. If we have any significant pain right here or shooting down that arm in that pattern of that radial nerve, it could potentially suggest that your pain is actually coming from that radial nerve right there. How we would treat this is very similar to how we test it. So we would do that position here, and we do what's called a glide. So gliding, instead of stretching on both ends, we want to pull one side and then the other side. So where that nerve goes to is the hand, and it comes from the neck. So we can use those two spots to help it glide better. So that would mean that pulling this arm here would pull that nerve towards it. So we want to bring the head towards the shoulder to help alleviate the pressure here and pull it that way. Then we reverse that position. So we pull the head to the opposite side and we relieve the wrist and we go back and forth like this, flossing that nerve and reducing the symptoms. All right, so now you're all done with that assessment, and what we want to do is to rank them from the most painful to the least painful. So let's say we had an 8 out of 10 on this one. Let's say we had a 2 out of 10 on this one. Let's say we had a 1 out of 10 on this one, a 5 out of 10 on this one, 3 out of 10 on this one, and a 0 out of 10 on this one. So we take the top 3 most painful ones. So that would be the extensor carpi radialis longus. Number 2 would be the supinator. And number 3 would be the finger extensors, the extensor digitorum. right there. So those would be our top 3 priority ones, and this is what we would build the plan around in terms of getting it fixed. And this would be in top 1, 2, and 3 in terms of priority on what we want to focus on the most. So for example, if this was our results, this is the plan that we would build around to target these 3 areas to get the biggest bang for buck in terms of our rehab progress. So next we'll go over the different types of exercises, the benefits behind them, and how we would structure this into a rehab plan. So the most basic, the easiest type of exercise would be called an isometric. It's called an isometric because we're not changing the motion, we're not moving the hand. So for example, on a wrist extension, we would hold that weight in the middle position with the wrist just slightly extended, holding that position there for an extended period of time, anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds. From here, we would rest in between sets and repeat. Now, this is a very basic exercise, but it has a lot of different benefits. It's best to use early on when the pain is elevated to help control that pain, to reduce it. It almost works like a pain pill where it helps to calm that tendon down, and it even sends signals to the brain to calm and to modulate that pain. It's great to start loading that tendon, to start strengthening it. It won't necessarily get it completely all the way to being fixed, but it's a great starting point. So if that pain is out of control, it's a great point to start at. The next progression from here traditionally would be eccentrics. So eccentric is the lowering phase of an exercise. So that's what we would call it, eccentric. The concentric would be the raising. With eccentrics, all we're focusing on is just that lowering part. So what we would do is lower that weight, nice and controlled, then use the opposite hand to raise it back up, and we would repeat that again, just focusing on the eccentric part of that movement there. So the benefit of eccentrics, it's an easy way and a comfortable way to start loading that tendon without overwhelming it. But in terms of bang for buck and in terms of clinical practice of utilizing it, I've gone away from using it because compared to just traditional raising and lowering, there's not much more benefits. And I just prefer people do the full range of motion of the exercise, especially getting that eccentric on the way down and concentric on the way up. So that would be the next progression from eccentrics to isotonic exercises, which just basically means the traditional types of exercises that you would see at the gym, where you control the weight on the way down and you lift the weight all the way up. So usually what I've been resorting to is transitioning away from eccentrics just straight into regular exercises. Then the last progression from there would be to plyometric exercises. So these are using a little bit lower weights, but faster repetitions, mimicking how that elbow and how that tendon would be stressed during sport activities or heavy loading. So what this would look like for the wrist extension would be a quick raising up and down. So it would be quick motions with minimal to moderate weights, loading that tendon like it would in a sports manner. This is best to do later on in the recovery process because it does load that tendon to a higher degree and it can provoke some symptoms if that tendon is not ready for it yet. But it is amazing in that last phase of recovery to get that tendon ready to get back to playing pain-free again. So those are the 4 different types of exercises that we can use throughout the phases of recovery. And there's different types of equipment that we can use for the strengthening. So we can use resistance bands, we can even use a flex bar or weights. And what I've seen in clinical practice is doing anything is better than doing nothing. But in terms of the biggest bang for buck and the best results is we've seen with traditional weights. And the reason for that is when we use a flex bar, that resistance is the heaviest at the top of the range of motion. So when that band is stretched the most, or when that flex bar is at the biggest resistance when it's fully twisted that way. With weights, it's equally distributed, and that weight is distributed at the top of the range of motion, but also the bottom. So what we hypothesize is that the benefits of the weights that we get is during that stretched position when that tendon is being loaded at the bottom. That tends to give us better benefits with that tendon in recovery than using resistance bands or flex bars. So whenever you can, use weights. Now, if you are traveling or if you don't have access to weights, these are a great alternative and they will get us some results, but in terms of long-term recovery, we haven't seen anything as effective as just using traditional weights. Next, I'll give you some guidelines in terms of how much intensity is okay, how much pain is okay, and what that should look like in terms of building that plan in a way that doesn't overwhelm the tendon, where it's just enough to start the healing process. So in general, from 0 to 10, ideally we'd like to have that intensity about a 7 out of 10. And that's what we've seen through clinical research, where we do need quite a bit of intensity, not to the point where we're pushing it to our limits, but challenging enough to the point that the body starts adapting. So that puts us at about a 7 out of 10. Now, what does that actually mean in terms of the exercises? The best way to visualize this or to understand this is a 7 out of 10 means that maybe you could have done 2 more repetitions. 3 would be tough, but definitely not 4. So we're approaching failure, we're getting close to it, but not going all the way to failure. So towards the end of this, that tendon, that muscle, you should be feeling it. It should be sore. It should be challenged. That motion should start slowing down. It should be challenging, but not going all the way to failure, just stopping shy of that. And in terms of pain, a little bit of pain, soreness, achiness is completely normal during this recovery. And we do want to feel it in those specific areas where we usually do feel the pain. But we just don't want to overwhelm the tendon and the elbow. And the best guidelines for that is to keep the pain to about a 3 out of 10 or less throughout the recovery process. That means that during the exercises, the pain is a 3 out of 10 or less. And for 48 hours after, that pain stays at a 3 out of 10 or less because of the delayed pain response that tendons have. An important thing to note here is that if we have that intensity at a 7 out of 10, but the pain is out of control, then it's okay to lower that intensity for the short term and then build your way up as the tendon gets better. So if you can't reach that 7 out of 10 intensity because of the pain, that's completely fine. Use pain as that guide and the biggest priority rather than pushing that intensity. One more important thing before we go into the programming and how to structure the rehab is a concept called stress shielding. So stress shielding means that when there's an injury in that tendon, our body will tend to protect the injured area. If we load it too fast or if it feels that it's unsafe, what will happen is the stress will go to the healthy fibers, the healthy tendon fibers there, instead of where we want that stress and loading going to is the unhealthy ones. The reason this happens is the body wants to protect itself. So when we load it too fast, when we do that motion too fast, or we use too much weight that the body can't control, it doesn't feel safe, the stress shielding kicks in to protect the area. We have more of that stress and strain in the healthy fibers, but not the unhealthy ones. So how do we get more of that stress and strain in the areas that we want it to? We would slow down the motions. We would control the tempo, doing 3 seconds on the way down, 3 seconds on the way up. You can even use a metronome to help you time these repetitions. We would use weights that are under our control, not heavy weights to the point where you're just throwing the weight around, but actually controlling that motion all the way throughout to the point where that tendon can relax. And then we transition that stress, that loading, to the areas that we actually want to stimulate to start getting better. So when designing a program, we have 3 different variables that we can manipulate. Those would be volume, intensity, and frequency. So by volume, I mean the total amount of work that we do. So the sets, the repetitions, just the total amount of work, of stress and strain that we put on that tendon. Intensity, in this case, would mean the resistance in terms of the weights, or if we're using resistance bands or anything else, of how difficult those are. And then frequency is how often we're doing rehab. So when we're starting off, what we would want to do is we would want to start with lower intensity, higher volume, and higher frequency. As we transition through the different stages and phases of recovery, we would want to start decreasing the volume, increasing the intensity, and decreasing the frequency. That's how we would fix this long term. But in the beginning, it's very important to prioritize heavier volumes because at high intensity early on could flare up that elbow and is often too much to handle. Because we have the intensity low, we're able to handle high frequencies for tendons. Especially early on, high frequencies tend to help to reduce that pain and get you started with your recovery process a lot better than lower frequencies. So next we'll go into the actual programming, and I like to divide this into 4 different phases. So let's use an example of a client here called Mark. And let's say the findings during that test with Mark was his number one pain being the extensor carpi radialis longus. Let's say he had an 8 out of 10 pain with this one. Let's say number 2 was his supinator at a 5 out of 10. And let's say he had pain with the extensor digitorum or the finger extensor at a 3 out of 10. So using these findings, we'll go over what to focus on during all the 4 different stages of the recovery. So the first phase of recovery I like to call reduce, which is our main focus is to reduce, stabilize the pain, so then we can rebuild from there. So the goals of this stage would be to, again, reduce that pain, stabilize the elbow, build a foundation that we can build upon, and get positive momentum going forward. So let's say his pain is at a general 6 out of 10. The goal would be to reduce it to about a 3 out of 10 before we start rebuilding from there. So initially, potentially we can work on some isometrics where we're holding that weight. Again, this is really beneficial to reduce that pain, to control that pain, and we can do 3 to 5 sets of 30 to 45 second holds. So that's what that programming would look like, anywhere within that range for all these 3 different spots that we're focusing on. Or potentially we can go from isometrics straight into maybe what I would call pump work, where we're doing very light exercises, high repetitions. So anywhere from 2 to 3 sets of around 30 repetitions. Now, 30 repetitions can sound high, but in most cases, the research shows that anywhere from 5 to 30 repetitions, we will get benefits from that exercise as long as we have that intensity up. And especially during the initial stages of an injury, we would want to do very low intensity, something very easy, for high repetitions to stimulate that blood flow to the area, to promote that initial stage of recovery, to help reduce that pain and not overwhelm the elbow as we're getting it stronger. So in general, during this phase, we would have low intensity, we would have high volume, and high frequency. In most cases, we would program light rehab to do every single day during this phase, but anywhere from 5 to 7 days is a good ballpark in terms of how often to do that rehab during this phase. And during any one of these phases, we usually program anywhere from 3 to 10 different exercises for most people, not only to address the root cause, but also if we found any compensations at their shoulder or neck, we're also adding in exercises to address those areas too. So that's a comprehensive approach to target the whole system. And again, something I want to reiterate is that this is a helpful way to think about all these different phases, but it is not structured. There is some flexibility there. You can go from one phase to the next one. If you have a flare-up, you can go back. But this is just a helpful roadmap and guideline for you to structure your recovery in a step-by-step process to keep you on track and to finally fix your elbow. So after we reduce the pain, after the pain is under control, the next step is to enter the rebuild phase. So this is where we start loading that tendon a little bit higher, start stimulating that recovery process, and start rebuilding it, rebuilding that strength so we can get back to doing our daily things pain-free or getting back to playing, lifting pain-free. So our goals during the rebuild phase is to start increasing intensity. So I wouldn't say that the intensity is high, minimal to moderate still. So we don't want to increase that intensity too fast. When we do that, we usually see more soreness, more achiness, potentially maybe even a flare-up. We want to start reducing that volume a little bit. The way we would do this is less sets, less repetitions, but increasing that intensity a little bit. So the volume would be anywhere from medium to high. And with the frequency, usually I would either stick to every day, or if we're having troubles with recovering, I would switch to alternating days, so every other day rehab. And usually during this phase, I would be doing regular exercises, full concentric and eccentric phases. And I'd like to program during this phase anywhere from 2 to 5 sets of each exercise, and usually sticking to a rep range of about 15 to 20 repetitions. So that's the rebuild phase. The goal of this one is to continue strengthening, to get that elbow to be more resilient without any flare-ups. Then after the rebuild phase, we go into what I call the return phase. So I call it return because this is where most people would either return to playing or they would get back to playing to the frequency that they used to play. And during this phase, what we want to do is turn that minimal to moderate intensity, start increasing it a little bit, so more moderate intensity. From medium to high volume, we want to cut that volume down a little bit to about moderate volume, especially now that we're starting to play. And we want to go from daily or alternating. Usually what works best for this phase is alternating. This allows that elbow to recover a little bit more now that we're using heavier weights and we're playing more often. So I usually recommend about 2 to 3 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions during this phase for the most important exercises targeting the root cause. Now, just because this phase is called the return phase, that doesn't mean that this is where you return to playing. This is where we start increasing and shifting that focus. Realistically, we could have been, for some people, already playing at phase 1, or maybe we start playing at phase 2. So it's not a hard rule, it's just a guideline of those different phases and at what point to return to playing more intensely or like you used to in the past. And last but not least, we have the reinforced phase, or the maintenance phase that I like to call it. This is where we keep that elbow strong, make sure it doesn't come back in the future, and just keep it healthy for a long period of time. So the transition from this phase, we would want to increase that intensity from moderate to high. We would want to start decreasing that volume to about low or moderate. And we would want to go from alternating to just about 2, maybe 3 times a week for this phase of recovery. And then our focus should be on plyometrics, where we're loading that tendon in a manner that's very similar to playing. I usually recommend from 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions is a good general guideline for those plyometrics at this phase. Or we can start implementing heavy, slow resistance, which means using full range of motion, heavier repetitions, slower tempo, about 3 seconds on the way down, 3 seconds on the way up. This tends to really strengthen and load that tendon to a great extent. And it's great to use in this phase of recovery because that elbow is now resilient. That tendon can handle that resistance, and this helps to strengthen it even further, increasing that capacity and making sure it doesn't come back in the future. So that's the 4 different phases of recovery, just to help give you a roadmap, reducing the pain, rebuilding the elbow, returning to your sport, and reinforcing, rebuilding, and maintaining those results. During this whole recovery process, you can use things to help manage the pain in the moment: massage, pin and stretch, where you're using a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball and digging into that area, moving that arm in different directions, moving that elbow in different directions, or using a tool like the Rolflex, which is really great at targeting that elbow, helping to decrease the pain, soreness, stiffness as we're getting back to playing, as we're loading that elbow with more and more weights. Again, some soreness, some achiness is completely fine. Other things to mention here is scraping. It can be really beneficial to help decrease that point tenderness on that elbow. Potentially during some of these phases of recovery, you can use voodoo bands, which has been really effective for helping to get that elbow unstuck and progress to the next phases of recovery. So those are just some helpful tools that we can use along this journey to help manage that pain as we're loading it more, using it more, and getting back to playing more. During this recovery journey, sleep quality is very important. Not just the sleep quality that we get, but with tendon issues in the elbow specifically, they tend to hurt a lot in the morning. And that could be due to how we sleep and the position of sleep. So it's important to help support. The best way to do that is use a pillow underneath that elbow and have that elbow bent at a 90-degree angle. This is the most comfortable position for that elbow to be in throughout the night. So that will help with sleep quality. You need to make sure you're getting enough sleep. You need to prioritize sleep during this phase because this is where the body recovers and responds. And the worse sleep that we get, we wake up with that elbow hurting more. It becomes frustrating and it impacts the recovery long term. Other important things to mention here is supplementation. Like we mentioned before, collagen is essential to rebuild that tendon because that tendon is made up of collagen. So supplementing with about 20 grams per day can be very beneficial, and we've seen a boost of anywhere from 10 to 20% in terms of the rate of recovery for people with tendon issues. And with the collagen, vitamin C has been found to help with the absorption. So potentially adding in or making sure that the collagen you have has some vitamin C in it to help with the absorption so it's even more effective. During this whole recovery process, it's important to get enough protein in so that the body can rebuild and use that proteins to help with the recovery process. If you're vegetarian, maybe supplementing with a protein powder to ensure that we're getting enough proteins. And another thing that could be beneficial here is supplementing with omega-3 just to help reduce the inflammation during the recovery process. But the most important supplement would be collagen, and that's what would give us the biggest bang for buck. So that's how to structure your recovery process in terms of the different phases, the programming, the weights, the repetitions to do, the volume, intensity, the frequency. Next, we'll go into how to get back to playing in a safe manner to make sure we're not overloading the elbow, but we're getting it ready for playing and getting back to playing like we used to. So is it okay to play when you have tennis elbow? And is it okay to play during the recovery process? In most cases, yes, but we need to make sure we're doing it in a safe manner. So resting helps to decrease the pain, but it doesn't fix the elbow. So that's why it's important to incorporate the activity. Getting back to playing is how we get it strong enough so we can tolerate it. So how do we get back to playing tennis 3, 4, 5 times a week? We start with 1 time a week and then we build our way up. But we need to do it in a safe manner where we're not overwhelming the elbow, making the injury worse, making the pain flare up when it's not ready for tennis yet. So again, tendons recover through an active approach, so complete rest is not the option, but on the other spectrum, we don't want to overplay and just make the injury worse. So today we'll talk about that sweet spot of enough play during the recovery process where we're not overwhelming the elbow, we're getting that elbow stronger and more ready for the sport so that we can get back to our normal activities. So when we play too early or too frequently, it's almost like we're picking a scab. So you can imagine you have a scab and we're not letting it rest and we're just picking out that scab, making it worse and worse and worse and not letting it heal. So that's how I want you to think about overplaying or playing too much. So the key is to not avoid playing at all, but to do it in a safe manner when you're ready, when the pain is under control. So that's what we'll go into next in terms of identifying the variables and seeing at what phase are you ready to get back to playing again. So the signs that we're looking for in terms of are you ready to get back to playing is the pain is under control. It's about a 3 out of 10 or less throughout the day. It doesn't get flared up with normal activities. You can get throughout a normal day with minimal pain. You're noticing that the morning pain is not as severe as it used to be, so it's under control. And yes, it's still normal to have a little bit more pain in the morning, but it's not like it used to be. What you should be noticing is that strength improving week to week, so you're feeling stronger, more confident in the elbow, and you're able to tolerate the rehab sessions with minimal soreness and no spikes in pain afterwards. If that's not the case, then you haven't built up the foundation yet to get back to playing safely. So your best course of action would be to focus on the recovery, focus on the rehab, build that elbow up so that it can handle those sessions as we slowly reintroduce them. And it's important to note again that tendons respond differently to activities than muscles do. Muscles, they usually hurt in the moment, but tendons, they can hurt in the moment, but sometimes they don't hurt in the moment with activity. Sometimes we pay for it afterwards, even up to 48 hours after. So those tendons have a delayed response, and it's important to monitor that pain not only during the activity of, let's say we go back to playing tennis, monitoring that pain to staying at a 3 out of 10 or less, but we want to ensure that that pain stays at that level for 48 hours after. So if you play and you don't have any pain, but you wake up the next morning and that pain is a 5 out of 10, that's too much and we need to cut back. So we're not ready for playing yet, or we need to cut back the intensity, volume, which we'll go into next. So I like to call this the 48-hour rule. It's just a helpful guideline to see how that tendon is responding throughout the process of getting back to playing again. So when we're getting back to playing, there's 3 different variables that we can adjust to make sure we have the perfect recipe to start getting back to playing 1 time a week, 2 times a week, and then back to our regular way of playing. So those variables would be duration, frequency, and intensity. And here's what I mean. Duration is pretty simple to understand. Playing 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours, that would be the duration of how long do we go out and play for. Frequency is how often. So 1 time a week, twice a week. It also incorporates back-to-back days or spreading those days out. And then intensity is how hard do we play in terms of The intensity, the ways we can adjust that is hitting it against the wall, drilling with a partner or a coach, or live play at a low level versus a high level. Those are some ways we can adjust the intensity of play when we're getting back into it. So here's some things to avoid with each one of those variables, especially earlier on as we're getting back to playing. So with duration, we see that anything after an hour tends to fatigue the muscles, tends to fatigue the whole body to a point where that tendon starts to take more of the force and take more of the stress. So in the initial stages, I would just limit the duration to about an hour or less. With frequency, we want that frequency to be low starting off, maybe just once or twice a week. And more importantly, we don't want back-to-back days. Back-to-back days doesn't give that elbow enough time to recover in between sessions, and they tend to accumulate exponentially. So that next day after that tends to give us significantly more pain than if we had a break in between. And intensity, starting off, we want to start with a lower intensity, controlling the variables, controlling the different shots and the way that that elbow would be stressed to not overwhelm it. So in general, we want to avoid long sessions, we want to avoid frequent sessions and intense sessions in the beginning. And how we rebuild is in this order right here, in terms of prioritizing duration over frequency and then frequency over intensity. And here's what I mean. So let's say we're getting back to playing and we start with a 30-minute session, one time a week. And intensity from 0 to 10, let's give it a 3. How we would progress this is we would prioritize duration, then frequency, then intensity throughout the different stages. And this is what I found to be the most efficient way to get back without flaring up that elbow. So let's say we start with a 30-minute session, one time a week at an intensity of 3 out of 10. And a great thing to do here is to focus on technique. If there is anything to fix with your technique, this would be a great opportunity because that intensity is low. We can work through those things that potentially contributed to that tennis elbow in the first place. So now we fix that during the recovery process and it's not a problem once the elbow is 100%. So as we progress through these different stages, how I want you to think about it is almost like you're climbing a set of stairs. So we unlock each step, and as we get to that next step, we want to stabilize, solidify those results, and then build positive momentum forward so we don't fall down the stairs and have to rebuild again. Now, if that happens, that's normal. Flare-ups happen here and there. What we would want to do during a flare-up is reduce the activity, manage the pain, and bring our activities in terms of the rehab playing down by about 50%. Bringing it down to about 50% allows that elbow to have enough time to recover. Then once those symptoms stabilize, we can start rebuilding again in that step pattern there. So next we'll go into how to progress playing when we've done 30 minutes one time a week at an intensity of 3. And again, we would prioritize duration first. So from here, we would start increasing that duration to 60 minutes, still keeping it one time a week and still keeping the intensity the same. We would stay here for a little bit until that elbow stabilizes, keeping the pain under control, making sure it doesn't flare up. If it can handle this and we're ready for the next step from here, we would progress. So now we made that jump from a 30-minute session to a 60-minute session. We're still doing it one time a week and we're keeping that intensity low. The next step from here is instead of continuing to increase that duration, we would want to add another day. So from here, we would keep it at 60. We would go up to maybe 2, maybe 3 times a week, but we would still keep that intensity at about a 3 out of 10. Good. From here, once that elbow stabilizes, once the pain is under control in this step, once we feel ready for that, that's when we slowly start reintroducing that intensity. Ideally, I would want that frequency to be back to your regular cadence of playing. So if you used to play 3 times a week, I would like to be back at 3 sessions a week at the same duration that you used to before we start increasing the intensity. Intensity is the last thing I would want to increase and get back to in terms of playing at 100%. Because it's the intensity that we see contributing to more soreness, achiness, and flare-ups as compared to everything else. So then from there, that last stage would be focusing on increasing the intensity back to what it used to be. So instead of drilling, instead of practicing, instead of working on your form, it's actually getting back to live play at that intensity that we used to play at. So from here, we can do 60 minutes or more back to our normal playing frequency. So that could be anywhere from 3 to 5 sessions a week. And more importantly, increasing that intensity back to 100% of what we used to play. So having that capacity back. So this is how to progress safely our return to playing without overwhelming the elbow in the moment. And it's important to incorporate our playing, our sport, with the rehab process so that both of them make sense together and they're aligned with your long-term goals instead of just avoiding playing altogether. In most cases, with most elbow injuries, there is a way that you can safely return to playing throughout that recovery process, and you don't have to be completely pain-free before you jump into playing. But again, we want that positive momentum going forward. Instead of falling off the stairs, we want to build up, climb that mountain step by step, solidifying the results along the way instead of slipping down, falling, and having to rebuild from square one. So don't be a hero, don't overplay. It feels good in the moment, but we pay for it in the long run. So that's how to get back to playing your sport safely. Next, we'll go into how long to expect this recovery process to be. And let me start this off by saying, in most cases, it's going to take more work. It's going to take longer than expected. It's going to be a frustrating journey where you feel like you hit a wall. And really, tennis elbow, after the years of helping so many people overcome it, what I've noticed is that it can be a very frustrating injury. It can feel like we're making some progress and then we're back to square one. And at times it can feel like we start questioning if we can ever even be pain-free. So keep in mind when I go over these different timelines, it's not the same for every person. Everybody's recovery timeline looks a little bit different, but if it is a mild case, we usually see that clear up with the right approach, with the right rehab, in about 6 to 10 weeks. For moderate cases, we see that take anywhere from 10 to 16 weeks on average in terms of getting back to playing and just everyday life pain-free. And in chronic, more severe cases, it can take all the way up from 3 months to 6 months, sometimes even longer, to return to baseline, to a point where it doesn't even feel like it's an injury anymore. So that recovery can be a journey, but the important thing to note there is that it's not predictable. Everybody responds a little bit differently. Everybody will have fluctuations in that pain. Sometimes you'll have a good month where you feel like it's almost gone, and then the pain comes back to the same levels that it used to be. And that can be very frustrating throughout this whole journey. So some people can experience some great results in the beginning within a week or two. Others, it may take 2 months to even start noticing any results. And that's why it's important to just focus on the rehab, have a good plan in place that you can trust and follow in terms of fixing this long term. So throughout this recovery process, it's important to pay attention to the small wins, celebrate those small wins along the way, because it can be a very frustrating journey. So what do I mean by those small wins, and what can we expect in the beginning? Potentially, some people may have a reduction in pain of 5, 10%, 20%. We've seen all the way up to 50% within the first 1 to 2 weeks, but that's not always expected. Some people, they'll take all the way up to 2 months to even start noticing any benefits. It really depends on the severity of the injury, your symptoms personally, how active you are. All those different variables play a role in that recovery process. So what should you expect in the initial phases, and what are those small signs of recovery? Number one would be just having more confidence with the elbow, being able to pick up your coffee mug in the morning, maybe being able to shake somebody's hand, just more confidence in the elbow and not second guessing yourself when you're picking up a coffee mug, opening up a door, or any simple motions like that. Another thing you might notice is less morning pain. So you wake up and that pain is maybe goes from a 5 out of 10 to a 3 out of 10. That's a great sign of recovery. Another thing that we note is maybe that area of pain starts to shrink a little bit, so it's not as diffuse. Maybe it's more localized to that bony part on the lateral epicondyle. We usually see in terms of the spectrum of pain, so the worst being burning, then sharp, then dull, aching, then soreness, then no pain. That's the usual spectrum of the different types of pains. So burning being the worst, maybe it goes from burning to sharp, then from sharp to dull aching to soreness, and then we usually see that soreness turn into no pain. So those are some things that you may notice. Maybe it goes from sharp to dull aching. That's a great sign of recovery and a positive sign that we're on the right track, even if the pain stays at the same level. So let's say they're both at a 5 out of 5. Because it changed from a sharp pain to a dull pain, that's a great sign in terms of that recovery. Other small wins that you can note is just doing more throughout the day or being able to handle more activities with the same pain levels. Because we're doing more, but the pain is staying the same, that's another sign of recovery that the elbow is getting better. And another great sign of recovery is that the flare-ups tend to last less. So when we do have a flare-up, instead of maybe 3 to 5 days, maybe that recovery time takes 2 days. That's another great sign that the elbow is recovering, the tendon is getting stronger, and you're progressing in the right direction. And when it does flare up, just keep in mind that flaring up does not mean failure. Flare-ups are normal during the recovery process. After working with 250 plus cases, we see that 80% usually have some type of flare-up during the recovery process, and some may even have multiple. So it's a very frustrating part of the recovery process, and it doesn't mean that you're on the right track or trajectory. It's just we shouldn't expect flare-ups, but if they do happen, we need to rebuild, stabilize the pain, and then work our way back up. And a great way for me to show you this recovery timeline is we actually had a client, and he was a software developer, and he developed this software that was tracking his pain levels throughout the whole recovery process. So on the bottom, let's have a timeline of 0 to 16 weeks. And then on this graph, we'll have a pain level from 0 all the way up to 10. And what we saw is not a straight line like this in terms of that recovery. As he was tracking his pain throughout this process, what we actually saw was that pain fluctuating. So let's say we started at an 8 out of 10. What we saw is maybe that pain decreased here, and then it would flare up, and then decrease, and then flare up, and then decrease, and flare up, decrease, just like that in this type of pattern where that pain fluctuates. So when we zoom out and we average that pain out, yep, it's decreasing in a straight line like this. But when we zoom in on any one particular week, we could be stuck with short-term vision and not really seeing that recovery there. So it could start at an 8, then it drops down to a 6, and then it goes back to a 7 or an 8, and it feels like we're stuck, but what's going on underneath is that tendon is healing, it's just taking time. So it's important to zoom out and to have a perspective of that recovery taking much longer than expected and looking at results long-term instead of day-to-day, week-to-week, because it can be frustrating when that pain returns to the same level, especially after what I call, so these are the peaks, and then these would be the valleys. So that fluctuation in pain is what really makes this a roller coaster of an injury to overcome. So hopefully that visual, that graph resonates with you and explains a little bit about the fluctuations in pain that you've had and reassures you that you're on the right track. But it's important to note that tendons, they do take longer than muscles, and on average we can expect a muscle injury versus a tendon injury. That tendon injury will take about twice as long in terms of that recovery process because of the less blood flow, because of the healing process is different, because of the collagen and how long it takes for that collagen to recover from. So that's why it can take much longer than other injuries that you've had in the past. Another thing to note with that recovery process is that we're not always looking for imaging findings to improve. What's more important is how we feel and the function and getting back to a pain-free daily life. So what I mean by this is there's been research studies suggesting that the tendon looks the same at day 1 versus 3 months later, but the person is now pain-free. So what actually changed? The capacity of that elbow, the resilience, the strength of that elbow, but in terms of the images, it looks the same exact thing. So what we're actually looking for long-term is to get back to our function, get back to our everyday life pain-free, and that's more important than having perfect findings through imaging, because at the end of the day, you could have a perfect tendon on that image, but still have pain. Next, we'll go into consistency, and consistency really is the key in terms of fixing tennis elbow. The people that I've seen have amazing results, fix this long-term after 10 years of pain, all have put in the work in terms of 100 plus workouts logged in on our rehab app that they've put in to fix that elbow. So what I like to say is, imagine that every rehab plan or every rehab program that you do daily improves that tendon by about 1%. So day to day, we don't really notice it, but soon enough, those days add up, those percentages add up until we're back to 100%. So consistency is key in multiple different ways, but if we stop the rehab process, we have to start over again. So we lose that momentum going forward. We don't start from square one, but we do lose some of that process. So it's important to stay consistent and to focus on the inputs rather than the outputs. So what I mean by this is, if we focus on the output of the long-term goal of being pain-free, that doesn't really tell us what to do on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't help us structure our plan. It doesn't help reinforce the right decisions to make to fix that elbow. But if we focus on the inputs, setting aside time to put in the work, to do it every single day, that's how we get the long-term results, is by focusing on the inputs. And every single day, that little bit of rehab will add up and eventually rebuild that elbow to a point where we're pain-free, and that's how we get the output. And remember, this is simple, but it's not easy. It only takes about 15-25 minutes a day of rehab to dedicate towards that elbow, which in theory sounds simple, but in actuality, when we're busy, when life gets in the way, when we have a family, when we have a job, all of that fights for our attention and pulls us away from those goals. So is it simple? Yes, but it's not easy on a day-to-day basis, and that's where accountability comes in. This is where you need to carve out time for yourself, be a little bit selfish because of your long-term goals, because you want to fix your elbow so you can live a pain-free life and live to the best of your abilities. And how we can do that is setting up alarms on your phone, setting up environments where you have all the weights, all the equipment needed in those common areas. So it could be in the morning next to your bed, it can be during work at your desk, or nighttime right before bed. Just having a ritual, having that time dedicated towards you, your health, and your recovery really makes a huge difference. And if you travel a lot, having a travel routine, having some resistance bands, some easy equipment to bring with you is key to keep that momentum going forward and to keep your recovery on track. So the workouts won't take forever, and they shouldn't take forever, but you need to protect your time. You need to be a little bit selfish on dedicating that time towards you, because if you're not, then it'll get stolen away by something else. Every day we have fires we have to take out, there's other things that take priority, and it's easy to slip away and have that accountability fall off the cliff. And with tennis elbow, more so than any other injury, having a positive mindset is key. During flare-ups, it's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to get frustrated when you're putting in all this work and it feels like you have to start all over again because the elbow flared up again. Or you're putting in all this work and you're not really seeing the results, and everybody else is back to playing pain-free. You start comparing yourself. It can be a very frustrating injury, and that's what I hear over and over and over again. And this can impact us in multiple different ways. So we all know about the placebo effect. If we believe that something will work, it works to an even greater extent. So if we believe something will work, there's a stronger likelihood that we'll get positive results from that. But not a lot of people know that the opposite is also true, and that's called the nocebo effect. If we believe that we're stuck in pain forever, that it's never going to get better, that this is something permanent, then it's more likely for that pain to return. It's more likely to be stuck in that pain cycle. And we get stuck in our head in that pain cycle because it's all we think about. When we wake up in the morning, that's the first thing we feel. When we're just using the arm throughout the day, that's all that we feel. And every time we use that arm, it's a reminder that we're still in pain. And this is where that mindset and having a negative mindset can really affect the recovery long term. It's because we get tunnel vision on the pain, we get tunnel vision on the injury, and that downward spiral can make symptoms work. It can affect our mindset in terms of we start believing, hey, maybe it's just age. Maybe I'll always be in pain. Maybe it's normal. And we start justifying the pain instead of having positive momentum and getting out of that hole of being stuck with this injury. So throughout the recovery process, I see two common mistakes that happen sometime in the middle of that recovery journey. So one is the story of Icarus, and it's a story from the Bible where Icarus wanted to be closer to God, to fly up into the heavens. So what he did is he used tar and feathers to fly closer to the sun, thinking that he'd be closer to God. So he would do this with his father, and then after a while, they would want to go higher and higher, closer to the sun. But eventually what happened is they flew too close to the sun to a point where it melted the tar, they lost the feathers, and they fell down. So that's a story that I like to use for those people that when they start feeling a little bit better, they overplay. They play way too much than they should. When they are playing, they feel good and they tend to overdo it even though they're feeling pain. And that's how they can push themselves back in the recovery process instead of getting back to playing in a safe manner. They tend to overdo it, and because of that, it sets them back and they have to restart. Another thing I see is a lot of times people will use their pain as their signal to stay consistent and put in the work. And as that pain gets better and better, their consistency drops off a cliff because now that pain, that signal to them that they needed to do the rehab is gone. And what they need to do in this phase is to find another stimulus, something to remind them to put in the work, or another goal. What's important for them to do is to find other ways to stay accountable and to stay consistent to continue the recovery, because yes, their elbow is feeling better to the point where they're back to their normal activities, but it's not completely fixed yet. And if they stop at this moment, then they don't get it completely fixed. And it's important to push through, stay consistent, stay on track of that recovery. And another thing that really affects consistency for most people is any travel plans. If they travel for the holidays to see their friends or family, if they travel for work, back and forth, business meetings, that often puts a wrench in terms of people's consistency and accountability to get the elbow fixed. What works best in this case is to do a short rehab routine, maybe adding some resistance bands to your backpack while you're traveling, or just your bags, something easy to bring, because it's not optimal and you're not going to bring all the different weights and dumbbells with you while you're traveling, especially if you're traveling internationally. But in most cases, when you are staying at a hotel, they should have a gym with some simple weights that you can use during the recovery process. So what I recommend is waking up just 5-10 minutes earlier, doing an abbreviated version of your rehab routine, maybe 5-10 minutes. This will give us a good boost in terms of continuing the results while you're traveling and not losing the momentum that we had. So traveling is not an excuse to stop the rehab. It's just an obstacle to manage during the recovery process. And in most cases, it's easily manageable with just throwing some bands in the bag or waking up a little bit earlier to use the hotel gym. Now, let's say you do have a flare-up. What's the best way to manage that, to decrease that pain? We would want to take a little bit of break of the regular activities that we do. I usually recommend to cut that to about half. So if we're using 10 pounds, maybe use 5 pounds. If we're usually playing for 60 minutes, cutting that down to about 30 minutes. And we do this until the pain is stabilized at about a 3 out of 10 or less for a 48-hour period. During this time, we can massage the area, we can use some heat, we can do some light exercises with some light weights. We want to keep the elbow moving so that we get the blood flow to the area. We stimulate that recovery without overwhelming it. So the same principles apply. When it is flared up, we want higher volume, lower intensity, and that's what calms the elbow down. And in most cases, sticking to the rehab at lower weights, lower intensity is better than just taking the day off. And because of how flare-ups can affect our mind and how important the mindset is for long-term recovery, it's sometimes important during a flare-up to take that time to reset your mind. Maybe meditate for about 5 minutes. Any negative thoughts that you have about your elbow, your recovery, just let them in and then let them out. Acknowledge them and let go of them so that you can continue on the right path. A flare-up is just a flare-up. It's increased pain in the moment. It doesn't mean we're not on the right track. It doesn't mean you'll be always stuck in pain, even if the flare-ups keep on happening. Just approach them in a smart way with a positive attitude to finally get it fixed. Especially if it's been going on for months, years, decades, it's important to take that time to reset your expectations, reset the mind, manage the frustrations, and get back on track with a positive attitude towards your elbow and towards your recovery. And at this point, you've seen how tough it can be, how frustrating it can be, And that's why it's super important to develop a why, a strong goal to aspire towards, and that's what we'll discuss next. Finding your why to fixing tennis elbow is probably the most important thing for you to do. Otherwise, if we don't have that North Star, if we don't have that goal that we're aspiring to, we will get off track. We will let things get in the way of our long-term results and success. And if we have a clear, defined goal, it'll help us push through flare-ups, setbacks, and get us back on track in terms of what matters the most to us. And goals create focus. If we have a weak goal, that's weak focus. We can get easily distracted, easily off track. But if we have a strong goal that we aspire towards, it makes our why big enough to put in the effort and put in the work at the moment to get that long-term result. So here's what I mean. A weak goal would be, oh, I just want to be pain-free one day. I just want to get to a point where it's not really bothering me. That's not really specific. We want to get very specific with our goals. For example, a better goal would be, I want to get back to playing 3 times a week of tennis, 60-minute sessions like I used to, 100% intensity, where I'm hitting backhand, serves, forehands at 100% without thinking about the elbow or without having any flare-ups or pain the next morning. That's a very specific goal with details, and that's something we can aspire to. That's a strong why in terms of putting in the work to finally getting it fixed. So that's why it's important to have a goal to aspire to, but as humans, we're much more wired to look at the negatives versus the positives. Sometimes it's easier for us to realize the negatives and to run away from that instead of towards a goal. Think about the ways that tennis elbow has affected your life and the cost that we incur because of that. I like to call this the pain tax, where we've been dealing with pain for so long, it starts affecting us on a physical level. Yes, we do have that pain. It's affecting us every day. It's reminding us, it's getting in the way of the things that we love to do. So now we can't play tennis as much. Now we can't play golf. Another important thing to mention here is the longer this goes on, the harder it is to treat. So not only are you stuck in pain for longer, now when you get around to fixing it, it takes longer to get back to baseline. So there's 3 different ways that we see tennis elbow affecting us in a negative way. That's physically, in our lifestyle, and mentally. So physically would be the actual physical pain itself. That sharp, annoying pain when we're using it, the dull, aching pain afterwards. It can be very frustrating, and that's where it turns into a mental cost. But in terms of physical cost, it's just not being able to do the things that we want to do, or not being able to do them pain-free, where that pain is getting in the way of that. In terms of lifestyle changes, maybe now we start losing tennis. We used to play tennis, golf. Our daily lifestyle is becoming affected because of the elbow. We're not using it as much. Maybe we become more sedentary. That also starts affecting us physically and with our health. There's multiple different ways that tennis elbow impacts our life, and mentally it becomes very frustrating, taxing, and overwhelming on a day-to-day basis. And because it tends to go on for a long period of time, it tends to add up, especially on that mental toll. And this spirals into the moment where we start to maybe get a nocebo effect, where our negative thoughts make our symptoms even worse. It makes it harder for us to break through that pattern and get to a point where we're pain-free, because our mindset is not aligned with our goals. And that happens because of how frustrating it is, how much it impacts us on a daily basis, and it's just a constant reminder that we're still stuck in pain and it's not getting better. And this can really put us in a spiral in terms of a negative mindset that impacts us all throughout our life, not just with the injury, but physically, mentally, and with our lifestyle. And dealing with tennis elbow really sucks. And I like to compare it to a rainy day. For example, if I really wanted to go out and play tennis today, but if it was raining outside, I wouldn't be able to. And that's how it feels like when you have tennis elbow. Even on a sunny day, you can't go out and play because you're feeling restricted. And because of that, you can't play like you used to, so you lose that social interaction, that connection there. You don't exercise as much, so maybe you're more anxious throughout the day. Maybe you start gaining weight, losing your overall fitness. And the worst part is when somebody messages you, hey, do you want to play? And you have to say no. So I'd like to compare tennis elbow to just a rainy week, or sometimes even months, sometimes even years and decades, because that's how long it can affect us. And that's the best way to explain to somebody that's never experienced this injury on what it feels like to have tennis elbow. It feels like every day is a rainy day and you're restricted. You can't do the things that you love. And because of how frustrating tennis elbow can be, The biggest thing we can lose is our identity. If we're a tennis player, a golfer, a dad, we can slowly start losing that because now we're not able to do or associate with the things that used to give us purpose. And because of how long it goes on for, maybe you haven't played tennis in a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and at this point you start even questioning yourself if you should even call yourself a tennis player. You lose that identity that you used to have around that, but now is being taken away from you because of this injury. So if that sounds like you and tennis elbow has impacted you, use this as a moment to finally motivate you to finally get rid of this nasty injury. And throughout this recovery process, throughout talking with hundreds of people dealing with this injury, we usually see 2 different types of people. One person that stays stuck in pain and another person that finally breaks through of the cycle of pain and gets back to playing pain-free. So the first person I like to call Tyler the tire kicker. This is the person that is unmotivated, not willing to put in the work, not willing to do the research, looking for a quick fix, quick solution to fix their elbow pain. And this is unfortunately the person that we see being stuck in that cycle of pain, not really getting the help that they need, not really doing the right things, not staying accountable, consistent to put in the work to finally fix their elbow. On the other side, we have serious Angie. Angie is motivated. She wants to get back to playing pain-free, to a pain-free lifestyle. She does the research. She understands that it's not going to be a quick overnight fix. She's looking for a long-term solution, something she can trust in that will finally be able to get her back to being pain-free again. And if you're watching this video and you got all the way up to the end here, chances are you're that second type. You're the person that's willing to put in the effort, motivated to get back to being pain-free, and willing to put in the work that it takes to finally fix this nasty injury. And if that's you, listen up, because next we'll go into exactly how we help people like Serious Angie fix their elbow pain and get back to a pain-free life. So at this point, we've helped over 250 people overcome their elbow pain and get back to playing pain-free. And I want to explain how we did that. And the best way to show you that is to go over Angie's story and how we got her from being in pain at about an 8 out of 10 pain to being able to get back to playing padel pain-free, and even competing in a tournament where she played back-to-back games completely pain-free and didn't have any flare-ups or pain the next morning. So Angie fits the perfect character of who we help. It's somebody motivated to get back to playing their sport pain-free, tennis, golf, paddle, pickleball, lifters. They've tried everything, nothing seems to help, and they're stuck with pain. They want a solution, a long-term plan to fix their elbow pain so they can get back to their regular everyday life pain-free. Let me give you a little bit of background on Angie and what happened with her. So she fell in love with paddle, which paddle is a sport very similar to a combination of pickleball and tennis. If you know those two, it's very similar to both of those. It's a racket sport and it puts a lot of pressure on that tennis elbow. So she became obsessed. She fell in love with paddle. It became her identity. It became her way to de-stress from the stressful life of everyday work, family, obligations. This was her opportunity to kick back, get some great exercise in, spend that time outdoors. It overall improved her quality of life, and no wonder she became obsessed with it. She soon went from playing just 1 time a week to 2 times a week to 3 times a week to doing multiple classes with different trainers to improve her skills and compete at a higher level. She liked being competitive, she liked the exercise, she liked the social connection and the identity tied to being a padel player. But then she noticed tennis elbow slowly creeping in. At first she would notice it during backhand shots and anytime she hit the ball over the head. Soon after that, it slowly started to creep into her daily life, picking up a coffee, brushing her teeth, doing her hair, even opening up a door to her car or the fridge. And soon after this, she started noticing that that pain would creep in at night. It would start to affect her, sometimes even wake her up in the middle of the night, affecting her quality of sleep. And when she woke up in the morning, that's usually when the pain would spike to the highest point. It'd be very frustrating and it'd be a terrible way for her to start the morning because it's the first thing she thinks about. Grabbing a cup of coffee, brushing her teeth, her daily morning ritual that was now being affected by her tennis elbow that started with paddle. She tried to push through, but it became apparent that she needed some help, so she reached out to her doctor that recommended just taking months off of playing paddle, just resting, and the pain would go away. Unfortunately, she didn't like the sound of that because she wanted to play as much as she could, and she didn't want to take time off the sport that she loved so much. Other things that she tried is those tennis elbow braces, which would help in the moment, but that pain would come back afterwards. She tried icing, resting, stretching, massaging, even dry needling, shockwave, traditional PT, and with all these different approaches, she noticed the same thing. Short-term relief, but every time she tried to get back to playing, that pain would come back. She was stuck in what we call the pain rest cycle. She would rest, she would stretch it, she would ice it, she would manage that pain would decrease, but the root cause of the pain wasn't fixed. So every time she got back to playing, that pain would spike back up again, and she would start from square one. And after 6 months of being stuck in this cycle, not being able to play as much as she wanted, trying all these different approaches and not really seeing the results that she was looking for, that's when she was frustrated and started looking for solutions outside of that. And that's when she found us. And initially, she was skeptical. Like most people, she said, okay, how does this work online? How do you assess? How do you treat? But she saw the testimonial, she saw that it could be possible and could be a solution for her, so she decided to take the leap of faith and reach out. And what really resonated with her is seeing others just like her being able to recover from tennis elbow. But not only that, they would mention that they were able to play throughout the process and incorporate playing with the rehab, and that really resonated with her because she wanted to get back to playing as soon as possible. When she reached out, the first step was a consultation call where we learned more about her elbow, her specific situation, and more importantly, identify if this is something we're 100% confident we can help her get back to playing pain-free. And thankfully, that answer was yes. So we explained to her the 3-step process that we take with overcoming elbow pain and getting people back to playing pain-free. And those are identifying the root cause of your pain, building a plan around that to finally get it fixed, and supporting along the whole journey until someone is back to playing pain-free again. This gives us the clarity on what exactly is driving that elbow pain, the certainty that you're doing the right things to finally get it fixed, the guidance in terms of the progressions, and the support along the way, and more importantly, faster results so that you're not guessing. So we started with the root cause assessment. Instead of guessing, instead of giving her a generic plan, what we did is we used her padel racket to isolate the exact area of pain. And based on that, we found the root cause, not just in her elbow, but we also found compensations at her shoulder and neck, which were contributing and making that elbow pain worse, especially on those overhead shots. We found that her pain was coming from the extensor carpi radialis longus, specifically with the backhand volleys. That's where she was having pain with this tendon. She also had pain in the supinator muscle, which was involved with those overhead shots as she was twisting over. That was causing significant pain with those shots. And she had pain with the extensor digitorum, which are often involved with gripping. When she was over gripping that racket, that's when she would get pain in the tennis elbow. So based on that root cause, we designed a plan for her to follow every single day that took about 15 to 25 minutes per day for her to finally overcome that tennis elbow, to start addressing that root cause and the compensations that led to that injury. So she knew exactly what rehab to do every single day, and we developed a plan for her to safely get back to playing pain-free. Initially, what that looked like was just 30-minute playing sessions, drilling and working on her technique so she can get back to playing nice and strong. This didn't aggravate the pain, so we were safe to return. And we also incorporated a warm-up routine that she can do before playing so that when she does play, that elbow feels good. So that's how we were able to assess virtually exactly what was going on and build that plan around that to finally getting it fixed. So she had our full support. She could reach out through our rehab app with any questions, comments, concerns. If there was a flare-up, we were there to support her and let her know exactly what to do. And more importantly, every 2 weeks, we had a check-in call with her to reassess the elbow, see the progress that we made, and making any adjustments to the rehab plan or the plan in terms of getting back to playing paddle more often. So during those check-in calls, every 2 weeks, we would reassess the progress that she made and update that plan going forward so we continued those results. Another thing that we focused on during these check-in calls was updating her plan in terms of how much she was able to play. So as she was progressing, as that elbow was getting stronger, slowly we increased how much she was playing throughout the week. And in the first 2 weeks of following that plan, in that first phase, she already noticed 20% reduction in her pain. She noticed more confidence throughout the day. She was able to trust her elbow more. Picking up a cup of coffee didn't hurt anymore, and that pain was under control at a 3 out of 10 or less. As she was feeling better and better, we progressed to phase 2, but with the increase in weights and increase of how much we were playing, she had a minor setback, a flare-up that got that pain up to a 5 out of 10. From there, we guided her on how to reset, reduce the pain, and get back on track. So we used massage, we used a little bit of heat, we decreased the weights, and we decreased how much she was playing for that week to reduce that pain, reduce those symptoms, build that foundation back up so we can get back on track in terms of the progress that we were making. Within 4 days from that flare-up, the pain was under control and we were back on track in terms of the recovery. And that's when we finally pushed through and got to phase 3, which is return to sport. So this is the point where she was back to playing 3 to 5 times a week, 1 hour each session at the intensity that she used to play, with very minor pain at a 1 out of 10, no flare-ups, no increased pain the next morning, and no continued dull, aching sensation throughout that day. This is when she finally felt free. It wasn't completely fixed, where she got to a point where she could go about her regular day without any flare-ups, without any pain. She could go and play as much as she wanted to without worrying about the pain the next morning or any flare-ups. She was almost at a point where she could say that it was not a problem anymore. That's when we entered stage 4, which is reinforcing those results. When she was at this stage, she was completely pain-free and it was really not a problem anymore. She tried to dig into her elbow. She couldn't find that spot. Every time she played, she didn't really feel that elbow at all. Just some fatigue and tiredness, but no pain or discomfort or even any soreness. At this point, the goal was to reinforce those results, to solidify them, and make sure that the injury doesn't come back in the future. So we designed a maintenance plan for her to follow just for about 2 to 3 times a week for another month to continue strengthening the elbow and make sure that we fix this once and for all. And that's how we were able to help Angie go from being stuck in pain, trying everything, having that tennis elbow for 6 months, to finally overcoming it, getting back on the court pain-free, and being able to enjoy that playing throughout that process instead of taking months off of playing. And after going through this whole journey, taking that leap of faith with virtual therapy, she actually, reflecting back, preferred this to inpatient visits. Drive through traffic, back and forth. She didn't have to schedule appointments with her busy schedule. She actually preferred virtual to in-person therapy for multiple different reasons. But the most important one was she finally got the results that she was looking for in terms of long-term success and long-term fix for that elbow so she can get back to playing pain-free.
So if that story resonates with you and you want that same step-by-step process applied to you and your injuries so you can get back to playing pain-free, just fill out the application below for a free consultation with our team. We'll take a closer look at your elbow to see if this is something we can help you fix. And if we're a good fit, we'll walk through what the next steps will look like to get you back on the court pain-free.